Hello guys, Quagsire here. Today we will be reading chapter 6 of the fanfic The Lives Worth Saving. If you want me to do any what if on this channel, just say so in the comments. Also, if you have any recommendations to improve my channel and grow on YouTube, please let me know. Anyway, I have taken enough of your time. Enjoy the what if. Chapter 6, Interlude, Friends, Old and New. Are you people going to make sure I return to my apartment every night from now on, or will this stop sometime soon? Lazily, Kakashi glanced up from his book and I smiled a greeting at the approaching redhead from his position against Haruki's doorframe. Yo! You didn't come to practice today. We wanted to make sure you were alright. Beside the copynin, Sakura was seated on his doorstep while Naruto and Sasuke were lazing in front of Naruto's. Kakashi pretended not to notice the twitch that was developing in Haruki's right eye. You did fine without me while I was away on my mission, Haruki pointed out dryly as he drew to a stop in front of them. And I'm not exactly on Team 7. But Haruki-san, Naruto jumped to his feet, blue eyes innocent and pleading at the same time. You need to keep up with your training too, and joining us would be perfect. Haruki arched an eyebrow at the blonde. Who said I wasn't training? I trained with Guy-san's team today. Kakashi blanched. Guy's team? For the love of God, why? Haruki's mouth tilted up into a slight smile. I promised, remember? I told him I'd train with his team as soon as I got back from my mission. Kakashi blinked. I thought you just said that to get away. Haruki frowned at him. Of course not. Only you'd do that. What's wrong with that team? Sakura piped up, her head cocked in a confused manner. Ignoring Kakashi's muttered everything, Haruki smiled a greeting down at the kunoichi before replying, nothing's wrong with Guy-san's team. It's just that Kakashi here can't seem to stand Guy-san's enthusiasm for training. One of his students takes after him too. The other two are quieter, Tenten, a weapons specialist, and Hyuga. Sakura frowned a bit as she rose as well, dusting her red dress off. I don't remember them in our graduating class. They're a year above you. Haruki explained. Still genin, but I believe Guy-san will be nominating them for the Chuyunin exams this year. Chuyunin exams? Naruto scratched his head. That's the thing we have to take to get to the next rank, right? Sasuke had straightened visibly at this, getting to his feet as well, and now turned to look at Haruki. Are they strong? Haruki gazed back at the Uchiha, carefully considering his answer. In terms of physical strength, he answered slowly. I'd say all three of them are already at Chuyunin level or just about there. But it takes more than brute strength to pass the exams. Other aspects are considered. Like what? Naruto looked excited now, and Sasuke seemed to have a hard time hiding the interest trying to surface on his face. Sakura looked less enthusiastic, but any new information was always welcome to her and she paid attention as well. Haruki paused for a moment and glanced over at the copynin, gauging his expression. Kakashi shrugged at him but nodded fractionally, giving Haruki free rein to tell them what he wished. Turning back, Haruki compromised. It wouldn't be fair to the other teams if I told you anything specific, but from my own experience, I found that they usually test your willpower and strategic thinking. He stopped for a heartbeat, gaze deepening as he stared down at the three genin. And teamwork. Teamwork is huge. Don't let anything tear you apart. A stilted silence followed this last bit, and Haruki blinked when he found himself the recipient of three confused stares and an odd one from Kakashi. He plastered on a small smile again and rubbed the back of his head. What I mean is that you're stronger together. And the examiners will take into account how well you can work as a team. Of course, he added, glancing at Kakashi and pretending not to see the faint frown still marring the copynin's brow. That would all depend on whether or not Kakashi nominates you for the exams. Instantly, all attention was fixed on the copynin and Kakashi quickly smiled at his students, absently noting that Haruki was very good at redirecting attention away from himself. "Ma," he said aloud. "At the moment, none of you are good enough. But the Chuunin exams are still some time away. Maybe you'll be ready then." Naruto grinned and gave them all a thumbs up. "I'll definitely be ready. And Sasuke and Sakura-chan will be too. We'll show everyone that we're the best team ever. Believe it?" Sasuke crossed his arms and rolled his eyes, but a confident smirk had made its way onto his face. Sakura just shook her head, but she couldn't quite hide the anxiety in her eyes, and Haruki made a mental note to do something about his old teammate's confidence level. Now, Kakashi straightened from his slouch against Haruki's doorway. "Didn't you want to ask Haruki something, Naruto?" The blonde's face scrunched up in thought for a second before his expression cleared and he turned eagerly to Haruki. "Oh yeah. Remember how you treated me to ramen that first day? Well, I've got several paychecks now from all the D ranks we've been doing, so I can treat you to ramen now." Haruki stamped down the amusement welling up inside him and nodded instead. "Sure, Naruto. Ichiraku's then?" Naruto nodded enthusiastically but clutched at his head when Sakura whacked him with a scowl. "We're treating Haruki-san today. He treated all of us, remember? We just agreed that you'd be the one to ask him." She turned to smile hopefully at the redhead. "I mean, if that's okay, Haruki-san. Sasuke-kun and I would like to repay you too, especially since you cooked for us yesterday as well." Haruki blinked at her before sliding his gaze over to Sasuke. The raven-haired genin nodded an affirmative and Haruki smiled back at both of them. "All right, I expect an extra large bowl then." Naruto grinned brightly up at him before bounding away, Sakura and Sasuke beside him and Kakashi and Haruki falling in behind them. X. An hour and a half later, only the two jounin remained in the ramen stand, the three kids having left after Kakashi had cheerfully informed them to meet at the bridge for training at 6 in the morning. Haruki had sent a cage bunchin with each of them, hunged into a bee, as they had departed, and hadn't relaxed again until the bunchin that had followed Naruto home dispersed without fuss. Now, Haruki poked absently at the remains of the large ramen Team 7 had promised him. Beside him, Kakashi had flipped open his book again and had already finished, his mask firmly back in place. Not that the man's face was anything Haruki hadn't seen before, but Kakashi didn't know that, and the redhead had made an effort to keep his eyes on his food earlier. "Will you train with us tomorrow?" The question was voiced nonchalantly, but Haruki glanced up in time to catch the intent glint in the copy nin's visible eye. Haruki shook his head. "I'm training with Asuma's team tomorrow." Kakashi looked mildly taken aback. "Are you going around training with all the teams? Kurene's the day after maybe?" Haruki just sighed and took a sip of sake. No, Asuma just caught me using one of my jutsus today when I was sparring Tenten and managed to con me into going." "So you trained with Guy's team all day?" "That must have been." The copy nin seemed to struggle for an adequate word. "Youthful?" Haruki offered helpfully. Kakashi's mouth twitched from behind his mask and he nodded. "Youthful. ×2. I hear that protege of his is just as bad as Guy." Haruki chuckled. "Lee-kun's not that bad. He's a good kid." The redhead tapped his chopsticks against the edge of his bowl for a moment, gaze becoming distant as his expression became more thoughtful. "He'll become a great taijutsu master. Better than Guy-san." Kakashi watched the other jounin curiously out of the corner of his eye. He never could understand the way Haruki said some things, those occasional thoughts that sounded more like facts with the solid amount of confidence and sincerity that Haruki curled around them. They fell silent for a while, comfortable with the lack of conversation as one concentrated on his book and the other turned to look out at the darkened street outside, back against the counter with one elbow balanced on it. "So did you really spend the entire day with Guy's team?" Kakashi turned as well after finishing a chapter, reclining against the counter as he started talking again. Haruki tilted his head just enough to glance sidelong at him. No, I spent the morning with them. Visited the Hokage in between. Then went to play a shogi match against Shikaku-san. Kakashi stiffened in surprise. Shikaku-sama? Really? Why? Haruki shrugged. He invited me yesterday. I couldn't get out of it. Kakashi frowned. He had heard of Hyuga Hisashi's miraculous return, of course. The Hokage had announced it privately yesterday to all the Umbu and the Jounin. And Kakashi hadn't missed the coincidental timing of Hisashi's return and Haruki's mission either. He already suspected that the redhead had something to do with it all, but he had kept his suspicions to himself then, and he would keep them to himself now. If the Hokage hadn't said anything, then it had to be a secret. But the council, at least, must have been told, and Shikaku must have found Haruki's role interesting enough to warrant a personal visit. So who won? Kakashi asked absently. He had played the Jounin commander once, and had been thoroughly thrashed in 2 hours. He did. Haruki-san did. Both Jounin blinked and turned to find the owner of the new voice. Kakashi's visible eye narrowed in concern when he saw Haruki's jaw clench at the sight of the Nara-heir entering the ramen stand. Hoping to take the redhead's mind off of whatever was troubling him, Kakashi restated his question to the genin. He couldn't quite remember the boy's name, making an effort to keep his voice light. So who exactly won? You seem to have a difference of opinion. Shikamaru stepped into the ramen stand, hands stuffed into his pockets as he focused on the two Jounin. He frowned inwardly when he noticed that the redhead wasn't quite meeting his gaze and was busying himself with drinking his sake instead. With a mental shrug, he turned his attention on the copy-nin sitting beside him. Haruki-san won, Shikamaru stated again, glancing at Haruki to gauge his expression. The man had a faint frown creasing his brow but didn't respond otherwise. But he forfeited and left before anyone noticed. Kakashi cast a curious look at Haruki and, catching his eye, the redhead sighed and elaborated, Shikaku-san would have won in 3 moves. And you would have won in 1, Shikamaru quickly cut in. He wanted to know why Haruki had forfeited on purpose. Talking directly to the Jounin seemed to finally gain his attention because Shikamaru soon found himself on the receiving end of an endless blue gaze. He stiffened at the flash of grief that surfaced briefly in Haruki's eyes, but when he blinked, the redhead looked as impassive as ever and he would have dismissed it as something he had imagined if it wasn't for the fact that he had seen the exact same expression back at his house when he had first met Haruki. The redhead only shrugged though and went back to his sake. Shikamaru didn't let it go. Why did you forfeit the game? He persisted. Haruki stared into his drink as he contemplated the Nara's question. How the hell had he gotten into this mess? And how could he get out of it now? Of course, he knew exactly why he had forfeited the match. Because Shikaku's interest in him would have reached new heights if Haruki beat the shogi master at his own game. Because the clan head would have tried and probably succeeded in wrangling another shogi appointment out of him. Because he hadn't wanted to answer any more of Shikaku's questions. Because he hadn't wanted to spend any more time in the place that he had gotten to know like the back of his hand in his own timeline. But most of all, it was because of the very person now standing in front of him. He hadn't wanted to continue looking at the younger version of his chief strategist and close friend any longer than he had to. Shikamaru's death had been ugly, bloodied chest, half his face gone, broken limbs, stomach sliced open and his organs spilling out, and Haruki's vision had blurred and he had seen the adult instead of the boy, dying on the battlefield with a smile on his face as he was finally allowed to let go of life and follow his friends and family. And it had taken everything Haruki had not to throw up right then and there. He had all but fled the Nara compound, and the walk back home had cleared his head a little. He had wanted to lock himself in his apartment and just curl up in bed and shut everything out, but Team 7 had been waiting for him, and God, when was the last time someone had waited for him? And he hadn't been able to say no when they had invited him out for dinner. Now he wished he had as he tried to find a suitable answer for the genin he still had trouble looking at. The others he had interacted with so far had had cleaner deaths in his time, still horrible and agonizing, and he had felt a little bit of himself die after each one of them had been killed, but at least their deaths had been less bloody, and by the time Sasuke had gone as well, he had been half out of his mind with grief already, and total recall of his general's body only came in his nightmares, so they had been easier to deal with. But Chika. I did not wish to continue playing, Haruki finally voiced, eyes focused somewhere over Shikamaru's left shoulder. And your father would have asked for another match had I won. Shikamaru's frown was now more pronounced as he tried to catch that cerulean gaze again. Would that have been so troublesome? It's shogi. Haruki downed the rest of his sake in one gulp before getting to his feet, placing some money on the counter to cover the cost of the alcohol. Next to him, Kakashi also slid off the stool, eye darting between Haruki and Shikamaru. I can handle a shogi match now and then, Haruki steeled himself and finally turned his gaze on Shikamaru, keeping it there for more than a few seconds this time. But a game with your father takes time and concentration. He's no pushover and I can't afford to be distracted when I play him. He managed a slightly strained smile at the boy and forced down the bile that was rising at the back of his throat, because his face should be torn apart, his body shredded. I have other things to concentrate on as well at the moment. Perhaps we can play again later. Barely pausing to nod a good night at Tuki, Haruki stuffed his hands into his coat pockets and ducked out of the stand, offering a hurried good night, Shikamaru-kun, to the bewildered genin still standing inside the shop before disappearing from view. Behind him, Kakashi hastily tossed his own money down, nodded at Tuki and Shikamaru, and then quickly ducked out as well, falling into step beside the fast-paced redhead. Kakashi didn't ask, though he sorely wanted to, but there were some things that one simply left alone until it was brought up on its own, and the copynin respected the other jounin's privacy. So he simply kept pace with Haruki until he had to turn off towards his own apartment, parting with a simple nod that the redhead returned curtly before turning down a street and quickly melting into the evening shadows. Kakashi watched him go for a moment, recalling the Narair's expression when he had been interacting with Haruki. The genin had looked just as confused as he felt. What had set the redhead off like that? With a sigh, the copynin started making his own way home. This was just another piece of the puzzle that was Haruki that he was trying to put together. X. Shikamaru shoved his front door aside with uncharacteristic irritability, making his way into the kitchen and dumping the takeout ramen in front of his dad at the dinner table. There you go, he announced distractedly, not noticing the odd look his father was sending his way. Next time, get your own dinner. Just because Kaya-san is out doesn't make me your delivery boy. How troublesome. He opened a cupboard for a glass and poured himself a cup of water before leaning back against the counter, still frowning in thought. Did something happen, Shikamaru? His father's voice made him blink, and Shikamaru glanced up to meet Shikaku's gaze. He shrugged, taking a sip before speaking. I bumped into Haruki-san at Ichiraku's. He paused and noted the immediate interest surfacing on his father's face. We talked. I talked, he mentally amended. He just wanted to get out of there. What about? Shikaku prompted. His match with you. Shikamaru gulped down the rest of the water and placed the glass in the sink. Kakashi-san was asking him about it. He said you won. I arrived in time to correct him. And what did he say? At this point, Shikaku had lowered the newspaper he had been reading and turned his full attention on his son. Not a lot, Shikamaru scratched his head and made his way to the dinner table, taking a seat across from his father. He said he didn't want to continue playing, and that you would have asked for another game if he had won. He said he wouldn't mind playing you again, but he doesn't want to play too often. He said he would need to fully concentrate when playing against you, and he had other things to think about at the moment. Those all sound like excuses, Shikaku observed after his son fell silent. Shikamaru just shrugged again, slouching back in his seat and stuffing his hands into his pockets. Did you do something to him? Shikaku frowned, noting the troubled scowl on his usually laid-back son. No. We just played a game of shogi. And did 20 questions in the process, he added fairly in his mind. Shikamaru glanced at him, expression suspicious. Are you sure you didn't insult him or something? Or did he move here from a different country and you killed one of his family members on a mission? Shikaku placed his newspaper aside, straightening in his seat. What are you talking about, Shikamaru? We played shogi and we talked a little. I've never met him before yesterday. What did he do? Shikamaru ran a hand through his ponytail, tugging at the ends in frustration. I don't know. I didn't understand. He could barely look at me. Shikaku's frown deepened. What do you mean? He didn't look at you when you were talking to him? Shikamaru heaved a sigh. No. I mean yes. He did, a couple of times. Briefly. It's not that he didn't look at me. It's that he tried and it was like he couldn't bear to. He stopped talking for a moment and gauged his father's expression. The man was still frowning, but there was confusion in his features now. Near the end, he managed to keep eye contact for longer than a few seconds, but the look in his eyes, Shikamaru held back a shudder because even as young as he was, he knew he never wanted to look into a mirror and see that same tortured despair stare back at him. He wasn't quite sure, but he expected that that had been the look of someone who had lost everything. I've never seen someone look like that before. And then he got out of there so fast you would have thought he was running away. Actually, I think he was running away. Shikaku leaned back in his seat. He had noticed the air of depression shrouding the redhead during the shogi match and even yesterday after the council meeting. But it hadn't been well hidden, and the amount sorrow Shikaku had felt had been small. Every shinobi carried their own grief, buried away so others wouldn't see it. But what if that grief was well hidden? It was obvious now that Haruki could hold a poker face with the best of them. So very good at keeping his thoughts and feelings from being noticed, and yet Shikaku had still sensed that sorrow. And this was when you entered the picture? Shikaku prodded. Maybe it was Kakashi who? Shikamaru was already shaking his head. No, they were on friendly terms. He definitely started looking like that after I stepped inside that ramen stand. Shikaku rubbed at his goatee before sighing and reaching for the ramen. You mentioned a look. What did he look like when he looked at you then? Shikamaru shook his head, accepting one of the boxes his father handed to him. I don't know. I can't describe it. And I don't think it was actually me he was seeing when he looked at me. Shikaku nodded and started on his ramen. It probably wasn't. Haruki hadn't even met his son until today. Someone who looked like him then? Shikamaru was a Nara through and through. But Shikaku had seen none of what his son had obviously witnessed, so it couldn't have just been physical similarities. Maybe I shouldn't go to practice tomorrow, Shikamaru grumbled from across the table. Shikaku blinked in surprise. He wouldn't be startled if his son was skipping out on practice because it was too troublesome, but this was because of some stranger he had just met. It's not like you to go out of your way for someone you don't know. Isn't it too troublesome? Shikamaru shrugged, chewing on his ramen. You didn't see his face, Tio-san. He just can't stand looking at me. Shikaku sighed but refrained from saying anything when a knock came at the door. Frowning, he rose to his feet and went to answer it. Outside, a member of his clan nodded respectfully at him before gesturing in the direction of the front gates. Shikaku-sama, Akazuma Haruki wishes to speak to Shikamaru-sama. Shikaku arched an eyebrow, taken aback for a moment before nodding. I'll handle it, thanks. The man sketched a quick bow before strolling off, the Nara's signature lazy slouch in his gait. Shikaku turned back into his house and called out, Shikamaru. Haruki-san's at the front gates. He wants to talk to you. His son appeared a few seconds later, looking confused. Me? Why? Shikaku shrugged and motioned for him to get going. I don't know. Go see what he wants. Shikamaru sighed and slouched out of the house. Troublesome. You could have just invited him up to the house. In truth, he just didn't know what to do when the redhead faced him again. Why would Haruki want to see him when it was obvious that he really didn't? X. Haruki had been halfway home when his mind had finally caught up to him and shoved his memories back into the darkest corner of his head. Then he had stopped, right in the middle of the street, and remembered the look of slightly troubled bewilderment on Shikamaru's, a younger one, a different one, face. And knowing the Nara, the genin would realize that Haruki didn't want to see him. That would, in turn, most likely throw a wrench in Team 10's dynamics tomorrow if Haruki couldn't even get his act together around the Nara heir. Sighing, he ran a hand through his hair before turning decisively in the direction of the Nara compound. Enough was enough. That was twice he had run out on Shikamaru, and if his times Shika was here, the strategist would have laughed at him for being an idiot. They were not the same person, and he had to stop seeing his chief strategist in this Shikamaru. Damn. That was easier said than done. Well, if he kept his focus on the genin and ignored the part of his mind that kept trying to replace the boy's face with a bloodied adult version, he would be fine. He would have to be. There was no way he was going to just avoid Shikamaru from now on. That would be more than unfair to him. So, mind made up, Haruki leapt to the rooftops and headed to the Nara compound. He would apologize and make sure the boy didn't do anything stupid like skip out on tomorrow's practice. X. Haruki-san? Haruki glanced up from his position against the walls of the compound, focusing on the features of the young genin. There. He could see the Shikamaru if he concentrated. Sorry to bother you so late at night, Shikamaru-kun, Haruki started, straightening from where his place against the wall. I wanted to apologize for earlier, at Ichiraku's. Shikamaru blinked before rubbing the back of his head. Of all the things he had expected, it wasn't this. He had been prepared to agree if Haruki came to ask him not to go to training tomorrow, or something of the sort. He hadn't been expecting an apology, and the sorrow he had seen before was gone from the redhead's eyes. Or carefully tucked away. So. I'm sorry, Haruki sounded awkward, and Shikamaru realized, with a mildly embarrassed start, that he had simply been staring at the redhead without responding. He quickly shook his head. It's all right. No harm done. They stood there for a moment in stilted silence, and Shikamaru frantically tried to think of something to say. Should he offer to skip out on tomorrow's practice? Maybe he should just wait for the jounin to say something first. Or should he invite the man in? God, this whole situation was troublesome to begin with. You will come to practice tomorrow, then? Haruki finally spoke, taking the decision out of Shikamaru's hands, and the Nara heir was startled when he heard the hopeful note in the jounin's voice. Are you sure? He stuffed his hands into his pockets for lack of anything better to do with them. I mean, I don't have to. It's just for a day, and dash. I'm sure, Haruki cut in firmly, blue eyes still holding his own. Shikamaru absently wondered how hard the redhead was trying right now. What happened earlier didn't have anything to do with you. It was just my own mind being stupid. I have nothing against you, Shikamaru-kun. Well, I definitely hope not. A jounin having something against me is just really troublesome. He responded automatically, and then paused to study the redhead's expression. Maybe he shouldn't have said that. But Haruki surprised him again with a slight smile, the first genuine one Shikamaru had seen on the jounin. Then you'll be there tomorrow? The redhead continued lightly. Shikamaru sighed but nodded. I'm not sure if Asuma-sensei told you, but we usually meet up at Ino's, she's one of my teammates, at her family's flower shop before going to train. Haruki nodded in affirmation. He did. I'll be there at 10. Shikamaru nodded again and the awkward silence descended around them once more. He could swear he heard his father snicker from somewhere out of sight and mentally scowled at the man. Eavesdropping. If only his mother was here at the moment. She'd have him cowering in a second for being so troublesome. Then I'll see you tomorrow, Shikamaru-kun. The redhead finally offered, and then raised his voice a little after Shikamaru muttered a good night. Good night, Shikaku-san. Shikamaru blinked and then spun around. He knew it. From the shadows of the compound walls, his father stepped into the dimly lit street, already nodding cordially at Haruki. Good night, Haruki-san. Shikamaru expected his father to mention the earlier shogi match, but Shikaku stayed silent as the redhead disappeared into the night. Why didn't you say anything? Shikamaru fell into step beside his father as they headed back indoors. Shikaku shrugged. He came all this way to apologize. I'll give him a break for now. There's always next time. Shikamaru rolled his eyes and idly wondered if he would be pushing too far if he asked Haruki for a shogi match tomorrow. Then he sighed. Why did even asking for a shogi game have to be so troublesome? X. At 6 in the morning, Haruki was up and dressed for the day, leaping over the rooftops towards the Hokage Tower. An Umbu had swung by earlier and informed him that the Hokage wanted to see him. Haruki suspected that Sarutobi had more questions about yesterday. You wanted to see me? Sarutobi glanced up as a familiar redhead leapt in through the window. His Umbu guards didn't even straighten at Haruki's appearance anymore, letting him pass without comment. He mentally shook his head. Was that a good thing or not? Yes, Sarutobi briskly activated the privacy seals again before turning his full attention on Haruki. I've sent out a message to Jiraiya and his reply just came back earlier this morning. He's on his way to track down Tsunade. In the meantime, I wanted to know more about your abilities in Fuinjutsu. Jiraiya couldn't find a way to permanently counter Orochimaru's cursed seal. You mentioned that you could? Haruki nodded, already sensing where this was going. If you can make Anko-san believe that I could get rid of her seal, easily. Sarutobi frowned faintly. Haruki had said he could, but only in passing. Now the redhead was confirming it, but surely there would be some complications. But what would you need? Sarutobi had to be certain of all the aspects of this counter seal. How much time? And what would be the side effects? Haruki tilted his head, observing him with careful cerulean. Old man, you don't have much confidence in my Fuinjutsu skills, do you? He asked mildly, ignoring the immediate protest that surfaced on the Sandame's face. There aren't any side effects. I need some of Anko-san's blood, her patience, her strength of will, her high pain tolerance, and a blank scroll. As for time, he paused to consider this, noting the Hokage's astonished face with some amusement. 2 hours. You're serious? Sarutobi asked with some disbelief. You can really get that seal off with only those things? Haruki nodded, eyes grave. Yes, especially since Anko-san doesn't even have the full cursed seal. And I've done it before. I got rid of Anko-san's seal in my timeline. Sarutobi relaxed at this. If Haruki had already done it once, then that was a different matter. Very well. I've actually already summoned her and she's on her way. Is it possible to do it now? You said 2 hours would suffice. Haruki nodded and reached into his coat to pull out a scroll. It was a good thing he was always prepared. A quick knock at the door made them both refocus their attention and Sarutobi temporarily pulled down the privacy seals to call the person in. Anko swept into the room, a good-natured grin on her lips and a stick of dango in one hand. Morning, Hokage-sama. She greeted, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on Haruki. What's this about? Making sure the privacy seals were up again, Sarutobi motioned to a chair as he spoke. Good morning, Anko. A bit early for sweets, isn't it? Anko waved a dismissive hand in the air as she took a bite of her makeshift breakfast and made her way over to the chair. It's never too early for sweets. You should really get some too. Now seriously, what's the problem? You never get me this early in the morning. Sarutobi nodded and waved a hand at Haruki. Anko, this is Kazuma Haruki. He paused when Haruki nodded briefly at the kunoichi in greeting. He's a fuinjutsu master. He can get rid of that cursed seal. A moment later, Anko was on her feet again, chair clattering back on the floor, glaring furiously at the redhead. That's impossible. No one's been able to do anything but hold it back. Even Jiraiya-sama's tried and failed. How could some damn jounin be able to? Haruki didn't so much as blink at Anko's tirade. I'm better than Jiraiya-sama. Anko froze, mouth opening but not finding any words to say. Better than Jiraiya? Impossible. Yet here was this pretty boy openly claiming it without any sort of arrogance. Stating it as if it was a simple fact. She shouldn't believe this. Getting her long dead hopes up now would be pointless when the redhead failed later on. And yet, he was still staring at her patiently, a scroll in one hand, the other still stuffed in his coat pocket, waiting for her to decide. Fuck you. Her mind snapped. What would you have to do? She said aloud, eyes narrowing. She noticed the dango stick clutched in her right hand and made an effort to relax her grip. Haruki waved the scroll. I'll need some of your blood to write out the seal. I'll be using my own chakra to make it. Then you'll activate it with your own chakra. You won't need to put a lot into it to start the process, the first bit of your chakras just to let the seal identify you as the owner of the cursed seal we want to remove. Then my seal will do the rest, but while it's working, it will keep drawing on your chakra. Not enough to kill you, but you will feel tired afterwards. Anko stared in disbelief. Just like that? No after effects? You just make this seal, I activate it, and boom, my fucking cursed seal's gone? Haruki shrugged. I'll need an hour and a half to get the seal ready, and it'll take about half an hour for it to do its job. He paused, and then warned, and it'll hurt. A lot. Like I said, you'll feel drained afterwards and you'll be suffering from chakra depletion, but that'll come back soon enough. Anko dismissed this easily. Chakra depletion was the least of her concerns. But nothing else? She pressed insistently. I'll still be able to continue as a kunoichi, and all my skill would be just as good as it is now. Haruki gave her an odd look. Of course not. She stiffened immediately and opened her mouth to curse the redhead out, but the jounin continued before she could. Without the cursed seal, you'll be better. How much better is up to you, but the cursed seal won't be hindering you anymore. If Anko hadn't been so stunned, she would have swore at him when she detected amusement floating just underneath the redhead's features. As it was, she scowled fiercely at him before turning to the Hokage who, now that she thought about it, she had honestly forgotten up until this point. Is this guy for real? She demanded. He's a Konoha jounin, but I've never seen him before. Where has he been? Sarutobi chuckled. He's been away on a mission, and yes, I do believe he is telling the truth. Anko frowned. How long was this mission that she had never seen him before? He looked around her age. Turning back to Haruki, she debated the pros and cons of the situation. If she believed him, then there really weren't any cons. Yeah, from what he had told her, it would hurt like a bitch, but she was a ninja, she could take it. Besides, she would put up with any pain if it meant getting her former sensei seal off of her. But should she trust him? How often was it that some shinobi popped out of nowhere claiming to be able to break one of the strongest cursed seals known to mankind? And yet, Sarutobi obviously trusted him, and Anko could sense no malice coming from the redhead. Despite her reservations, she could feel a faint stirring of hope inside her. If this worked, Orochimaru's mark would no longer be on her. She wouldn't ever have to worry about the seal being activated again. She would be free again. How much blood do you need? Her mind made up, Anko barreled forward as usual, gaze steel-like as she pulled out a kunao. Haruki nodded and withdrew another scroll, unsealing a small empty ink jar. Half of this would be enough. Anko nodded briskly, finishing off her dango before dropping down onto the floor with the ink jar to start her part of the process. Haruki glanced over at the Hokage before motioning at the privacy seals. You should probably strengthen those if you don't want anyone hearing screaming or feeling bursts of chakra coming from your office. Sarutobi blinked but nodded, rising to fully activate the privacy seals. He told the Umbu at his door that, short of the announcement of the apocalypse, no one was to enter. He locked the office door for extra measure and closed the windows as well. There, Anko held up the ink jar, now half filled with her own blood, and Haruki accepted it with a nod, taking a seat on the ground as well with the blank scroll open in front of him. Anko eyed his empty hands curiously as she quickly bandaged her palm. Don't you need a brush or something? Haruki smiled faintly at her before holding up one hand. Blue-white chakra immediately began glowing around it and Anko gasped as she felt the power extend from that hand. A hum of raw strength edged it, but the pure energy emitting from that hand, down to its very core, was soothingly warm, like sunlight. And Anko was sure she had never felt any chakra like it in her entire life. Before anyone could say anything, Haruki moved his hand over the ink jar, letting his chakra draw out the blood. With deft control, he coated the blood with chakra and brought it over the scroll. Tuning everything else out, he started drawing out the seal, each crimson stroke he depicted on the paper glowing in his wake. Anko was staring at the redhead's work with open interest. She had never seen anyone perform fuinjutsu this way. Weren't seals written with blood or ink and then activated with chakra afterwards? Sarutobi had drawn closer and, after a short undecided moment, sat down next to the other two shinobi as well. It wasn't as if anyone else was around to see him act un-Hokage-like. And he had never seen anyone, not even Jiraiya, draw seals with chakra like Haruki was doing. I'm better than Jiraiya-sama. Haruki had sounded certain, but it wasn't until now that Sarutobi fully believed the redhead. After all, Minato had been the only one to ever surpass Jiraiya in fuinjutsu. But each precise stroke of crimson against white proved Haruki's skill and Sarutobi could only watch with a sense of proud awe as an intricate seal slowly formed under the time traveler's steady hand. For the next hour and a half, the only sounds in the Hokage's office were the near-silent hum of chakra and the whisper of liquid on paper. Haruki worked out each part of the seal without hesitation. He had already done this seal 3 times, once for practice, once for his times Anko, and once again for his times Suzuki. Suzuki's seal had been no picnic to remove, being the most powerful of Orochimaru's cursed seals, but the snake Sunin had finally died, so that at least had made the process that much easier. Finished, Haruki glanced up, releasing the chakra he had gathered to his right hand as he used up the last of Anko's blood. He blinked, somewhat startled when he realized that both the room's other occupants were still staring avidly at his seal. That's it? Anko's voice was subdued for once as her eyes traced the design Haruki had made. Only the center, depicted with a sun-like pattern, looked simple. That will remove Orochimaru's cursed seal? Haruki nodded, scanning the scroll for any mistakes. We can start anytime. Anko took a deep breath before nodding firmly. What do I do? The Jounin placed the scroll back on the ground in front of Anko, spreading it open as he motioned for the Sandaime to move back. Sarutobi rose to his feet and retreated to his desk, still studying the seal. He had never seen anything like it. He could pick out pieces of designs, a few swirls for foreign chakra removal and some strokes twisted together for stability, but it was the intricate kanji on either side of the center that interested him. All the kanji were tied into the wind element. The kanji for wind served as the base before spreading out from there. Air streams, breezes, and gales, all the way up to monsoons, squalls, even storms, and tied together again with zephyrs. Haruki-kun, Sarutobi interrupted. Why is the seal based on so much wind element? How would this be able to remove the cursed seal? The only part of this that relates back to the actual seal is the center, and it is only a basic design for curse removal. Haruki offered a half smile as he settled on the opposite side of the scroll. My elemental affinity is wind, old man. This seal will be the support for me. I'll be the one removing the cursed seal through this. Anko straightened, looking mildly alarmed. Wait a minute, I thought the seal would be doing the work. You didn't mention anything about yourself. Haruki frowned at her. I won't hurt you. Anko snorted derisively. If I was worried about you hurting me, Red, I wouldn't have agreed to this in the first place. The seal could just as easily kill me. I'm asking what will happen to you. The redhead's brow cleared, taking the sudden nickname in stride as he smiled again. Ah, I see. I'll just be a little tired afterwards. Like I said, no after effects. The kunoichi eyed him suspiciously before shrugging grudgingly. Sarutobi quickly cut in again before they could start. But I still do not understand how so many wind elements could help in this process. Haruki pointed at the hollow center. This is where the cursed seal will end up afterwards. I'll be drawing it away from Anko-san and into the scroll. Orochimaru's seal is strong, yes, but in the end, when broken down, it is still built up from any other basic seal. The wind elements I put into the seal will help me break the curse down. By the time it leaves Anko-san, only the most basic component will be left, which will be easy to lock away with a simple curse removal seal. He paused and glanced up at the Hokage. Trust me, old man. I know what I'm doing. When put like that, and explained so thoroughly, Sarutobi could hardly find fault with it. He nodded and settled against his desk, watching as Haruki directed Anko to place her hand on the center design. This'll hurt, the redhead warned once more, extending a kunai. Bite down, though that'll probably shatter in the process anyway. Anko rolled his eyes but complied, placing her uncut hand on the center of the seal and biting down on the kunai. When you're ready, she heard the other jounin say as both the redhead's hands moved to hover over the wind kanji. Send a little of your chakra into the seal. Anko sucked in a bracing breath and then shot a small flare of her chakra into the scroll. Almost immediately, pain spiked through her body as the seal lit up in front of her. Biting down on the kunai, she tried to hold back the scream threatening to tear from her throat, but as her neck burned, her vocal cords reacted and the kunai shattered as chakra rushed through her and her voice rang out in the room. Opposite her, Haruki clenched his jaw and concentrated on the cursed seal that he had connected to with his own chakra as soon as the process began. Closing his eyes, he used his chakra to close in around the seal. Cage it, with the winds of a monsoon. Lock it down, with the everyday winds that seemed so insignificant apart, yet held so much power together. Then fight it, with the howling power of a tempestuous squall. And finally, destroy it, with the untamed strength of a raging storm. The half-finished cursed seal stood no chance, and Haruki could almost hear its frustrated shriek as its power broke, snapping under his hands as it yielded to his control. Drawing it away from Anko's body was much easier now that its power had been reduced. Opening his eyes, Haruki watched the fading patterns of the cursed seal of heaven run down Anko's arm and spill onto the scroll. The kunoichi had stopped screaming at this point, but the hand still pressed against the seal was near white and shaking. Haruki waited until the last of the cursed seal left Anko's skin and then reached out to wrap a gentle hand against the kunoichi's. We're done, Anko-san. You can rest now. Anko could barely keep her eyes open, but she still managed to rasp out, It's gone? The cursed seal? She managed to catch the smile Haruki offered her as he confirmed, Yes, it's gone. Completely. The relief and gratitude that crashed into her at this reassurance was enough to knock her out, and she slumped sideways, not even feeling the strong arm that wrapped around her shoulders and carefully lowered her to the ground. Haruki made sure Anko was no longer touching the scroll before focusing on his task again and performing a set of seals. Instantly, the center sun pattern flared red as he pushed some of the Kuwabi's chakra into the seal. Orochimaru's cursed seal immediately disappeared within the crimson light and Haruki finally released his chakra, shoulders slumping with mild exhaustion as he snapped the scroll shut. "Haruki-kun?" Haruki glanced up, blinking when he realized that the Hokage had dropped down across from him beside Anko and was currently checking her pulse. He released a short sigh and mustered a small smile. "She'll be fine. Just let her sleep it off." And, he waved the scroll. "Orochimaru's cursed seal is locked away. We just need to burn the scroll and it'll be completely destroyed." Sarutobi easily picked up the unconscious Kunoichi but kept a concerned eye on the redhead as he moved her to the couch in his private office. "And you?" "I'll be fine," Haruki assured, rising to his feet as well without showing any fatigue. "I just need some rest. Do you want me to get rid of this, or shall I?" Sarutobi extended a hand. "I'll take it. If you don't mind, I'd like to show it to Jiraiya when he comes home." Haruki frowned, glancing down at the scroll before handing it over with a shrug. He planned for both Jiraiya and Tsunade to know the truth about him anyway. Letting him see some of his seals wouldn't be that big a deal. "I should get going, old man." Haruki straightened completely, walking over to give Anko a once-over before turning back to the Hokage. "I have training later with Asuma's team." Sarutobi smiled at this. "Ah, he asked you then?" Haruki immediately stiffened in suspicion. "You did something." "It was not a question. I knew he didn't ask me just because of my jutsu." The Sandame's smile widened a little. "I thought about what you said, about Asuma." He paused and a thoughtful frown drifted onto his brow. "I had a chat with him a few days ago. We went to the Hokage monument and I tried to show him a little of what I saw in Konoha." He shook his head ruefully. "He really is quite detached from this village. But he didn't refuse when I invited him to dinner with me and Konohamaru afterwards. And let me guess," Haruki rubbed a hand over his eyes. "He wanted to know why you were acting out of character." Sarutobi chuckled. "Well, we haven't eaten together since before he left Konoha, so of course, he wanted to know why. But I told him it was because of something you said. Nothing specific, but he seemed to take an interest in you." Haruki heaved a sigh. Not only did he have to deal with Shikaku, now he had a curious Asuma on his hands as well. Team 10 Sensei was usually laid back and easygoing, but once something caught his attention, nothing would deter the man until his interest was sated. "Did the dinner go all right then?" the redhead finally asked. Sarutobi nodded cheerfully. "It went better than I hoped. Konohamaru being there helped too." Haruki grunted but said nothing more as he stifled a yawn. He barely got any sleep at night and removing Orochimaru's cursed seal didn't help keep him awake. Nodding an abrupt goodbye to the Hokage, he headed for the window. He still had a few hours before he had to meet up with Team 10. The convenience store should be open. He could grab a few popsicles and kill some time on top of the Hokage monument. It was funny, he mused as he leapt out of the window. Once upon a time, ramen would have been the first food to come to mind. But he didn't eat anywhere near as much as he used to nowadays, and frozen ice creams had become something of a habit. Because his stupid old sensei always loved sharing them with him. X. "Good morning, Asuma. Ino should be out in a few minutes." Asuma turned at the greeting, nodding cordially at the Yamanksa clan head as Inoichi stepped outside the flower shop. "Good morning, Inoichi." The two fell into a comfortable silence as Inoichi watered the plants outside the shop and Asuma continued smoking, keeping an eye on his other two students several feet away across the street. Chuji was munching on chips as usual. Asuma made a mental note to suggest dieting, and Shikamaru was slumped against a pole next to him, not bothering to hide a wide yawn. He sighed inwardly. There was a reason he started their training so late in the morning. He had a feeling that Shikamaru wouldn't even be able to stay vertical if he called them out at 7. And then there was Ino, who had to help her mother set up shop for the day at 9 in the morning. Asuma didn't particularly mind though. If they were going to meet late, then they might as well meet at a time that was suitable for everyone. His thoughts turned to the jounin who would be joining them today as he glanced up and down the street. Haruki seemed to spend a lot of time with Kakashi. Would the redhead have picked up the copy nin's habit? It was already 5 minutes to 10. And Asuma couldn't really blame the man if he was late. He knew Haruki had been very reluctant to join them in the first place, and while he had been willing to insist until the redhead capitulated, why Haruki had agreed after only a few minutes of persuasion from him was still a mystery. And he was curious to see who this jounin was. As far as he knew, Kakashi never willingly spent much time with other people. He wasn't a loner and he socialized when he joined them for a few drinks at the bars, but the man never went out of his way to seek out company, preferring to stay to the side and read those damn books of his. Yet Kakashi had invited Haruki to train with his team, and the short interaction he had seen between them after they had been given their missions by the Sandaime had been relaxed and comfortable. The copy nin obviously considered the redhead a friend, even though they had only just met. This fact only served to mystify him even more. And of course, there was his father too. Asuma could barely remember the last time he had sat through a dinner with Sarutobi without getting into an argument or sitting in stilted silence, much less actually enjoyed one. His father had clearly been deliberately cautious whenever he spoke, careful not to come on too strongly when voicing his opinions as he had in the past, but Asuma couldn't ever recall his father trying to hold a conversation and not attempt to make Asuma see things his way. He had appreciated it, and they had somehow managed to get through dinner with only friendly exchanges between them. And afterwards, once Konohamaru had gone home and he had walked his father back to the Hokage Tower, his curiosity had gotten the better of him and he had asked, just before they had gone their own ways for the night, "What?" Imagine his surprise when Haruki's name had come up. Sarutobi hadn't said much more than that, and Asuma had left, mulling over the mysterious jounin no one seemed to know. The very next day, he had checked the mission registry and noted the day that the redhead would be returning from his intel mission, which, now that he thought about it, suspiciously coincided with Hyuga Hisashi's miraculous return. He would have to think more on that later, and had sought out the redhead as soon as he could. He had remembered Haruki's promise to Guy and had wondered whether the other jounin would keep it or not. He knew when and where Guy's team trained, there wasn't a single shinobi who didn't, what with Guy's youthful rants, and had swung by the training grounds on his way to the Hokage Tower. He had only been mildly surprised when he had seen the redhead training with one of Guy's students. He had been much more stunned by the jutsu he had witnessed Haruki execute. The lightning jutsu, at least in A-class, had been flawless, but from what he had managed to overhear without being detected, lightning wasn't even Haruki's natural affinity. Wind was. Same as him. Asuma could count on one hand the number of ninja that had a wind affinity in Konoha and still have fingers left over, and most of them hadn't even completely mastered it. Wind was the hardest element to control after all. But if Haruki could pull off such a powerful jutsu with an element that wasn't even his main affinity, he had no doubt that the redhead could do some serious damage with wind chakra. A couple of approaching Chuyunin came into view and distracted him from his thoughts when they drew level with his students. He didn't have time to do more than frown in their direction when he saw the sneers on their faces before Inoichi spoke up. "Ino tells me that you invited Kazuma-san to your training session today." Asuma turned his head to take in his female student's father. Inoichi had a broom in hand and was sweeping up some of the stray leaves and petals littering the ground even as he pinned Asuma with that piercing blue-green gaze. He mentally shook his head. Sometimes, he still couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that Konoha's greatest interrogator had retired and become a florist. "Yes," he replied, removing his cigarette and putting it out first. Inoichi didn't mind that he smoked as long as he didn't do it while they were having a conversation or when he was within a few feet of his daughter for an extended period of time. He caught my attention when he was training with Guy's team and I invited him to train with my team for a day. He glanced up and down the street again. He should be here soon. Inoichi's thoughtful frown made him think back to the clan head's words. Kazuma-san, Inoichi had called him, but there had been an underlying edge of something that pinged on Asuma's radar. Do you know him? The man may have been retired, but he hadn't lost any of his famed impassivity that hid his emotions from the world and made enemy Nin quiver in the interrogation rooms. We have met, Inoichi acknowledged without pause. In passing only though. Which really didn't give away anything, but Asuma was willing to bet that Inoichi was interested in the red-haired Jounin as well. Suddenly raised voices caught both their attentions and they turned simultaneously to watch the obvious argument between the two Chuyunin and Asuma's students. Neither Chuyunin had seen Asuma or Inoichi, or they would have probably had second thoughts about picking on the two genin. Fatty like you could never become a shinobi. Asuma visibly winced. Chuji hated being called fat and Shikamaru could be fiercely protective of the Akimichi heir when the occasion called for it. As it was, Chuji had flushed deep red, hands curling into fists, his bag of chips crumpling in one angry grip, and Shikamaru had straightened from his lazy slouch, eyes narrowed. Shut up. I'm just big-boned. Chuji snapped back. What's your problem anyway? Don't you have anything better to do? One of the Chuyunin's lips curled up mockingly. What, can't even stop for a chat? You're not very nice. Guess you inherited bad manners as well as your figure from your folks. Asuma's jaw tightened and he made to move forward to stop the altercation, feeling more than seeing Inoichi tense up beside him even as Shikamaru took a step forward and snapped, Oi, back off. But the damage had been done and Chuji moved to lunge forward, face twisted into a rage. Only to pull up short when both Chuyunin were, quite suddenly, yanked off the ground and into the air by some invisible force, hanging upside down from one ankle as their other limbs flailed and startled yelps slipped from their mouths. Asuma watched with growing astonishment when, a fraction of a second later, a familiar figure leapt down from the flower shop's roof and landed beside the group, crimson hair and long trench coat trailing behind him. Wind, Asuma realized, eyes picking out the faint traces of wind currents wrapped neatly around both Chuyunin's right ankles before moving to the motionless hands stuffed in the redhead's coat pockets. Haruki is manipulating the wind itself without using any hand signs. Good morning, Shikamaru-kun. Haruki had turned to the Nara heir, who now looked slightly wide-eyed, and now greeted him with a small smile. Blue eyes then flickered to the still red-faced Chuji and offered a similar greeting. And you must be Akimichi Chuji. Good morning. I'm joining your team for practice today. Asuma's students blinked before glancing at each other, and Asuma found himself relaxing again when the red started to seep out of Chuji's features and Shikamaru's slouch returned. Beside him, Inoichi made no move to stop this new exchange. It seemed like they both wanted to see how Haruki would handle this situation. Morning, Haruki-san. Shikamaru's lazy drawl had returned and Asuma made a mental note to ask the boy about the note of familiarity in his voice when he addressed the redhead. Good morning, Chuji echoed, peering almost hesitantly between Haruki and the two Chuyunin hanging in the air. Hey. One of the Chuyunin, the same one that had spoken last, snapped. Are you doing this? Haruki turned to face the upside-down shinobi, head tilting to observe them with a thoughtful air. Yes, I suppose I am, the redhead agreed after a moment, and Asuma had to suppress a snicker at the bug-eyed looks Haruki received after the nonchalant concession. He heard a quiet snort of amusement from his right and was quick enough to catch a shadow of a smile on the clan head's lips. Both Chuyunins flushed darker, their faces already red from the blood rushing to their heads, before the other Chuyunin snarled, Well, put us down. Who are you anyway? Are you even a Konohanin? It was then that Asuma noticed that Haruki did not wear the Konoha headband anywhere on his body, at least not visible to public eyes, nor was he wearing the flak jacket issued to Jounin underneath his coat, only a simple black long-sleeved shirt. "Yes, I am," Haruki replied easily, not at all perturbed that he was talking down at the Chuyunin, whose heads were hanging about a foot off the ground. "I just don't carry the headband around with me." The first Chuyunin just glared back at the redhead, struggling in vain against the wind holding him in the air. "You're attacking a fellow shinobi then? That could get you demoted. Let us go." Haruki gave them a thin smile that didn't come close to reaching his eyes. "No." The Chuyunin all but growled, one arm swinging out in a heated attempt to hit the red-haired Jounin, but a gentle gust of wind rushed by and his coat flapped out of the way of the flailing fist. Asuma wondered if that breeze was natural or not. "Why the fuck not?" the Chuyunin demanded angrily, humiliation lining his face. All at once, Haruki's features froze over and mercilessly cold eyes drilled into the Chuyunin's brown ones. The teen immediately recoiled. Out of the corner of his eye, Asuma saw Inoichi take a step forward, one eyebrow raised in interest. "I don't know," the redhead's voice was still deceivingly light. "You tell me." The other Chuyunin seemed a bit smarter and his eyes darted between Haruki and Chuji before glancing up at the wind still wrapped tightly around his ankle. Finally, the teen cut his losses and relented, eyes on Chuji as he forced out through clenched teeth, "Sorry, Akimika-san." The first Chuyunin glared, arms folding in front of him with some difficulty, and Asuma scoffed at how ridiculous the teen looked. "I ain't apologizing," he sneered. "Why should I when everyone knows that the Akimichis are just a bunch of faak?" His words tapered off into a screech of alarm when he dropped abruptly towards the ground, arms shooting out to flounder wildly around him as he came dangerously close to face planting into the earth before Haruki's wind yanked him back up again. Asuma hadn't even seen the Jounin's hands twitch. "Come again?" Haruki asked coldly. The Chuyunin seethed for a long moment, eyes taking in the unforgiving cerulean gaze piercing him before self-preservation instincts finally kicked in. "Sorry, Akimika-san," the teen spat out at last. Haruki shrugged and turned back to Chuji, the previous coldness leaking out of his features as he focused on the Akimichi air. "Well, Chuji-kun. Personally, I've heard more sincere apologies from my enemies, but I think that's the best we're going to get out of these two right now." Chuji looked downright baffled, but the anger had died and the genin only observed the two Chuyunin with a somber air before announcing firmly, "Okay then. Let them go." Haruki smiled a little before turning back to the two Chuyunin. The first one just had to open his mouth one last time. "We fucking apologized," he bit out. "Now let us down." Without a word, the redhead blinked once and both teens found themselves released and free falling for all of 2 seconds before crashing face first onto the dusty ground. Muttered curses cut the air, but they jumped up soon enough, hands nursing their noses as they backed away, their entire focus on Haruki. Haruki only smiled at them again, his expression hard and icy. "You should watch what you say in the future, boys. It might come back to bite you in the ass one day." Both Chuyunin tried glaring at the redhead, but Asuma could detect visible fear in the way they scrambled out of sight, hurrying away from Haruki's frigid stare. As soon as they were gone, Haruki's expression warmed again, features falling back to their typical neutrality as he turned back to the two genin. The three stared at each other for a moment before Haruki sighed and reached a hand up to tuck a lock of hair behind one ear. "Interesting way to start off our training session," the Jounin finally commented, before adding somewhat hurriedly, "and what I just did. I don't think you should do that. That was a pretty bad example considering I'm supposed to help teach you today." "So, Haruki rubbed the back of his head, and Asuma could suddenly see a softer side to the redhead, and he wondered if this was the side Kakashi knew, because the man didn't seem so unapproachable anymore. "Just pretend you didn't see that, okay?" A few seconds of silence ticked by before Shikamaru broke out into snickers, hands stuffing themselves back into his pockets as an amused smirk tilted his lips. Chuji joined in after a moment, chuckling along as Haruki blinked down at them almost uncertainly. "No way, Haruki-san. Your method's effective." "I'm pretty sure they were about to wet themselves near the end," Shikamaru observed lazily. Chuji laughed outright at this, noticeably warming to Haruki as the Jounin stared down at them with a wry grin. Still smiling, Chuji glanced at Shikamaru and then up at the redhead before asking almost hesitantly, "What would you have done if I didn't want you to let them go?" Haruki cocked his head in contemplation before his gaze swept the street and landed on the 2 garbage cans Inoichi had dragged out earlier. "Well," he gestured towards the trash cans. "They probably would have fitted in those." Chuji grinned and Shikamaru huffed out a laugh, and Asuma knew neither of them would have any problems interacting with Haruki. The Jounin was good with kids. A moment later, he found himself staring into steady cerulean as all 3 made their way over in unspoken agreement. "Good morning, Asuma, Inoichi-sama," Haruki greeted quietly as the group reached the flower shop. "Morning," Asuma grinned a little as he nodded in the direction that the 2 Chuyunin had disappeared in. "Nice entrance." Haruki actually looked faintly embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that." He paused before amending, "At least not in front of your students." Asuma chuckled. "You didn't do anything to hurt them, except their pride anyway. And it was a nice display of your wind affinity." The redhead stiffened briefly and Asuma found himself on the receiving end of a sharp searching gaze for a fraction of a second before nodding briefly in acknowledgement. Asuma blinked. Had he imagined that? "You are very proficient at manipulating the wind," Inoichi cut in thoughtfully. "Can you travel long distances in a shorter amount of time that way?" Asuma found this question somewhat strange, but Haruki took it in stride and nodded. Inoichi seemed satisfied with the answer and offered a slight smile instead. "You're standing outside my home. No need to be so formal." Haruki blinked before dipping his head in acquiescence. "Inoichi-san then. Now you just have to meet Chuji's old man and you'll have met the whole set." All eyes turned to the slouching Shikamaru and Asuma raised a questioning eyebrow at him. Shikamaru just shrugged a little before glancing up at Haruki. "He's already met my dad." Inoichi switched his gaze back to Haruki. "You've met Shikaku?" Haruki looked mildly uncomfortable but nodded somewhat warily. "Yes. I met him a few days ago." He paused, a small amount of irritation surfacing on his face. "We played shogi." Inoichi chuckled and Asuma felt his lips quirk up again. Most of the village knew of the Nara clan head's prowess in shogi. "Well," Inoichi grinned a little. "No one's beaten Shikaku in decades. Don't feel too bad." Shikamaru spoke up before Haruki could get a word in edgewise, scoffing, "My dad lost." "Haruki-san won." "Shikamaru-kun." The redhead had probably been aiming for annoyed, but the warning came out more exasperated than anything else. For his part, Shikamaru didn't look all that concerned. Inoichi's eyes widened. "You beat Shikaku?" Haruki grimaced, shifting in his coat. Asuma had no idea why the other Jounin seemed to think beating the Sandame's chief strategist at his own game was a bad thing. "Yes," Haruki finally admitted, glancing reproachfully down at Shikamaru, who shrugged unrepentantly. "I suppose so." The interest in Inoichi's eyes was visible now and Asuma guessed that this was why Haruki seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation, though why the redhead disliked the attention of a clan head was still a mystery. Behind them, the door to the flower shop suddenly swung open and Asuma arched an eyebrow at the relief that flooded Haruki's features for a moment. The red-haired Jounin really didn't like attention. "Morning, sensei." Asuma turned to smile down at his third student as she finished pulling on her elbow warmers. "Morning, Ino." He turned to nod at the redhead beside him. "This is Haruki. He's the one training with us today." Ino turned her attention on the redhead and smiled up at him. "Ha!" She jabbed a finger at Shikamaru and Chuji. "Those 2 idiots probably didn't bother introducing me before. I'm Yamanaka Ino." Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too, Ino-chan, Haruki replied with a half-smile, but Asuma frowned when he detected a trace of wistfulness in the upward tilt of his lips. He glanced sideways at Inoichi and noticed that the blonde had also caught the emotion and was frowning attentively once again. All right then, Asuma clapped a hand on Haruki's shoulder. I was thinking that we could start on chakra control today. He glanced at the redhead. We're probably starting that a bit late, but I've been seeing what they could do with their clan techniques. Haruki nodded. Not that late. Kakashi's team only started about a week ago. You trained with 4 Sakura's team? Ino piped up. Yeah, Haruki shrugged. Kakashi invited me. Sakura's got near perfect chakra control. Asuma speculated whether or not the Jounin had said that on purpose when Ino turned on him and demanded, "We have to start practicing chakra control now." Asuma sighed and nodded before glancing at Haruki again. I guess I'll let you take over today. I was planning to do the tree walking exercise and then get them started on their D-rank mission. A strange glint entered the redhead's eyes. What mission is it? Asuma withdrew a mission scroll from his hip pouch. They're going to be retrieving the daimyo's wife's cat today. Simultaneous groans erupted from all 3 genin and even Inoichi chuckled at them. Haruki on the other hand brightened visibly and Asuma wondered if he should worry for his team. Great. Haruki turned an almost evil grin on the 3 genin who all promptly took a step back. I know exactly what to do today. Shikamaru eyed their temporary sensei. This really didn't bode well. The smile Haruki was wearing reminded him of the one Naruto always wore just before one of his pranks blew up in someone's face. Troublesome, he muttered, stifling a yawn at the thought of training. But at least the Jounin was looking at him today. Shikamaru couldn't detect any shadows in the man's eyes and he even seemed a bit more open. And defending Chuji was definitely a bonus in his book. Chuji only smoothed out his crumpled bag of chips, shaking it rather forlornly before tossing it away in a nearby trash can. He didn't really mind training, and he was curious to see what this Jounin would come up with. Besides, Haruki was nice. He didn't look at him with that amused indulgence that most people looked at him with when they found out he was training to become a shinobi. Ino was somewhat nervous about the gleam in the Jounin's eyes, but she hid it well. She hoped whatever training he had in mind wouldn't mess up her hair too much. She might see Sasuke today and she really didn't want to be a sweaty mess if that happened. If you don't mind, Asuma, Inoichi suddenly spoke up. I'd like to come as well. Ino whirled, eyes wide with surprise and a small amount of apprehension, but it was Haruki's face Asuma automatically checked. The redhead looked as impassive as Inoichi on a bad day and he couldn't pick out any emotions at all. He turned back to the Yamanaka clan head and agreed with an easy nod, but he suddenly had a feeling that, if Inoichi wasn't present, he'd probably have been blistered by a death glare from the Jounin standing next to him. Asuma sighed as Inoichi disappeared back into the shop to grab a coat and drop a word to his wife. Glancing sidelong at Haruki, he abruptly felt a bit like an ass when he caught the restless frown marring the redhead's brow. Now that he looked closer, Haruki seemed a little on the tired side as well. The Jounin was already training with them per his request, he could at least cut the man some slack if he really didn't want Inoichi tagging along. If you want, Asuma voiced quietly so that only Haruki could hear. I could tell him I changed my mind. Refusing a clan head could be a little daunting, refusing Yamanaka Inoichi even more so, but he would manage. Haruki was already shaking his head, withdrawing a hair tie and pulling back his hair into a simple ponytail. It's fine, Asuma. Don't worry about it. The redhead offered him a reassuring smile before moving away to talk to his students, asking them about their training up until now. All 3 kids answered easily enough and Asuma was surprised to see that even Shikamaru, who usually couldn't be bothered to join in on a conversation, was responding to Haruki's questions. With another sigh, he lit a new cigarette. Training hadn't even started yet and he was already thinking too hard for his liking. Wasn't being a sensei supposed to be easier? X. 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 20 minutes later, they were in the more forested part of the training grounds and all three genin were making half-hearted attempts at climbing their respective trees. Asuma, Inoichi, and Haruki stood to the side, watching as Ino managed to make it about a third of the way before the wood crunched under her foot and gravity dumped her back to the ground. Shuji managed a few running steps to about a quarter of the tree before tumbling back down as well, and Shikamaru took a few steps upwards, only reaching about 3 feet above the ground before he too had to jump back to the forest floor. Asuma said nothing, content to let Haruki run the show today. He wanted to see what kind of sensei Haruki would make. Beside him, Inoichi was leaning against the trunk of a tree, arms folded in front of him as he kept an idle gaze on the genin. They're exactly the same, the little brats. At Haruki's irritated mutter, Asuma and Inoichi both glanced at him before following his line of sight. Surprisingly, his gaze was settled firmly on Shikamaru. Who was the Nara heir similar to? One of Kakashi's students perhaps? Haruki, for his part, was mentally comparing Shikamaru to one of his own former students, a Nara as well and one of the Nara heir's younger cousins. Akio had been just as lazy as Shikamaru and had also pretended not to know the tree walking exercise. A Nara needed to learn chakra control to be able to control shadows effectively. Heaving a sigh, he moved forward until he was staring down at Shikamaru, who was lying flat on his back at the moment. When it came to a Nara, bribery was the only way to go. Shikamaru-kun, Haruki smiled pleasantly down at him as Ino and Shuji also paused and he felt Asuma and Inoichi's attention focused on his back. If you make it up this tree using only your chakra in the next 5 seconds, I'll play a game of shogi with you. Haruki had noticed the familiar calculating glint in Shikamaru's eyes during the few times the boy had brought yesterday's game up and, knowing his times Shikamaru's love of a challenge when it came to shogi, he knew the genin would take his offer up in a flash. Indeed, a moment later, the brown-haired genin was standing again, pausing only long enough to gather chakra into the soles of his feet before taking off for his tree. 5 seconds later, Shikamaru was standing sideways at the very top, obviously knowing he had just been bribed but smirking triumphantly anyway. Haruki snorted, shaking his head in exasperation before jerking his head at the ground to prompt the boy back down again. What amazing progress, he deadpanned dryly. Now get back down here. Shikamaru just grinned a little and scampered back down as able as any squirrel. Do I get my shogi game? He asked as he came to a stop in front of Haruki again. Rolling his eyes, the redhead nodded. After practice, or later, whenever you're up for it. Now go sleep or something. You'll need your energy later. Shikamaru's grin widened as he sauntered away and settled at the base of his tree for a morning nap. Haruki hid a smirk of his own. There would be no shogi game today. After the training he was going to put these three through, they would be dying on their feet. Turning, he caught sight of Ino and Shuji gaping at Shikamaru. Catching their attention, Haruki stared pointedly at their own trees. Well, what are you waiting for? The longer you two take, the more free time Shikamaru-kun gets. Immediately, Ino scowled but her face flooded with determination and she took off for her tree again. Shuji glanced enviously at his best friend but straightened and continued the exercise, redoubling his efforts as he concentrated on his chakra. Making his way back to Asuma and Inoichi, Haruki found himself on the receiving end of twin stares of disbelief. He mustered an innocent look that almost always worked to get him out of doing paperwork whenever Suzuki or Niji hunted him down to complete it. Both shinobi blinked in surprise before Inoichi released a startled laugh and Asuma shook his head. You just bribed one of my students, Asuma pointed out, voice mildly amused. Haruki scoffed. All three of them are unmotivated right now. Trust me, you'll be resorting to bribery in no time. Asuma sighed and glanced at his students. I don't think Shikamaru would agree to shogi matches with me. Kid's a genius. No, Asuma's eyebrows shot up at the redhead's certain tone. "He'll enjoy playing against you." Blinking, Asuma glanced at Inoichi, who had been silently observing their exchange. The blonde shrugged a little even as Haruki continued, oblivious to their confusion. "But you could always bribe him with cloud watching or something," Haruki continued easily. "And you could treat Chuji-kun to lunch. Though not too often," he added with a slight grin. Asuma just sighed, scratching his head. He really should go on a diet. Haruki tilted his head thoughtfully. "Perhaps a small one," he conceded. "But he'll grow into himself." Inoichi glanced curiously at him. "What do you mean?" Haruki hummed absently, eyes focused on Chuji. "He's an Akimichi. Can you imagine what would happen if he had the body size of, say, Shikamaru-kun? He'd never be able to handle his clan's techniques." He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "He'll be fine. In a couple years, he'll be all muscle." Turning to give them a sharp, fierce smile, he added darkly, "And then we'll see what other people say about him when he can put them through the floor." Asuma looked between the redhead and Chuji, not quite able to hide a smile. He knew not many people saw Chuji as shinobi material. It was nice to hear someone speak about him with so much faith. Inoichi remained focused on Haruki. He remembered, back in his genin days, that Chaoza had had the same problem. His size and love of food had made it difficult for the other kids their age to accept him. But Chaoza had grown up to become a powerful shinobi, and Inoichi had never had any doubts that his son would be the same. But it wasn't every day that he heard someone else say something similar with so much conviction. "And what about Ino?" Inoichi spoke up again, glancing at his daughter. He was curious to see if Haruki would speak as bluntly about her as he did the others while he was around. "How would you get her to work?" Haruki didn't even hesitate, turning his head to look at him. "Her rivalry with Sakura. Ino-chan wouldn't want her to get ahead." Inoichi nodded in agreement as Asuma listened on. He knew of Ino's rivalry with Harano Sakura, but didn't really know the details. "It's too bad, really." Inoichi eyed his daughter with a small frown. "They used to be pretty good friends." Haruki surprised them by actually laughing out loud. It was soft and didn't last very long, but it was genuine and the first one either had ever heard. "The best kind of friends can be rivals as well, Inoichi-san," Haruki commented lightly. "They'll make up sooner or later." Asuma cocked his head, fiddling with the pack of cigarettes in his jacket but not pulling it out. There was a ring of familiarity in the redhead's voice when he said this. "Did you have one then? A rival?" Immediately, the cheerful light died in Haruki's cerulean gaze and something dark and ugly and haunted replaced it, making both shinobi freeze. And then the redhead blinked and they found themselves staring at ice, blank and impassive as Haruki replied curtly, "Everyone has rivals." Before Asuma or Inoichi could ask further, Ino called out from the base of her tree, panting for breath, "Haruki-san, how did you know Shikamaru could climb the tree?" The redhead turned his attention back to the three genin, forcing himself to relax. Chuji was looking over as well and Shikamaru had opened his eyes to peer at him. Haruki nodded at Shikamaru's tree. "What's the difference between Shikamaru-kun's tree and yours and Chuji-kun's?" As Ino drew closer to Shikamaru's tree, Haruki glanced at Inoichi. "You knew Shikamaru-kun could already do this exercise, didn't you?" Inoichi shrugged, smiling slightly. "Shikaku did the same thing when we first started, though." He glanced sharply at the red-haired jounin. "Our sensei couldn't tell. Shikamaru's tree doesn't have any dents or scuff marks." Ino exclaimed, turning to Haruki again. Haruki's mouth twitched up at the dawning realization on both Asuma and Inoichi's faces. "Exactly," he nodded. "I knew someone who had near-perfect chakra control, even as a genin. But even she left small dents and scratches up and down her tree when she did this exercise. Shikamaru-kun's tree is unmarked," even though he was dropping back down to the ground at around the same height for 10 minutes. He eyed the lazy Nara with some amusement. You may not want to work much, Shikamaru-kun, but what you did only showed that you already knew how to regulate chakra properly, and it was actually more work than if you hadn't been able to climb the tree. Shikamaru stared at him before thumping his head back down onto the arms folded neatly behind his head, grumbling under his breath. Haruki grinned before nodding at Ino. That's how I knew. Now back to work. Haruki settled back against a tree again as Ino made a face and trotted back to her tree. Beside him, Inoichi had arched an eyebrow. Good observation. I never really paid attention to that. Asuma nodded in agreement. How'd you realize something like that? Most senseis wouldn't point something like that out. Haruki shrugged. The one I mentioned, the one with good chakra control, she was my teammate. She managed to get up to one of the higher branches on her first try and only improved from there. I wasn't very good. I put too little chakra into my feet, so I couldn't really get that far. I asked her for some tips and noticed it when I was bugging her. Who was your teammate was on the tip of Asuma's tongue, but a warning glance from Inoichi was enough to keep the question to himself. The clan head was right, Haruki probably wouldn't take the question well. With a mournful sigh, Asuma slid down the length of the tree and settled on the ground. If he couldn't smoke, then he could at least make himself comfortable. He was probably in for a long wait. X. 3 hours later, Asuma jolted awake when a sandaled foot prodded his ribs. Blinking, he stared blearily up at Haruki, who looked rather annoyed. Yawning, he stretched and got to his feet, noting the amused glint in Inoichi's eyes as he took in his surroundings. His 3 students were gathered in front of him, munching on sandwiches and drinking from water bottles while staring at him with varied expressions of irritation and, on Ino and Chuji's part, exhaustion. Had a nice nap, Asuma-sensei. Ino scowled at him. Asuma stifled another yawn and mustered up a sheepish look for them. How are the exercises coming along? Ino and Chuji both brightened at this question. We got to the top of the tree, Chuji announced proudly, and Ino grinned beside him. Asuma blinked in surprise before smiling broadly at them. Great. You both got it in only a few hours. That's amazing. What's amazing is your need for sleep, old man, Haruki grumbled from beside him. Not even Kakashi slept during his team's exercises. I'm not an old man. Asuma protested, holding back a grin at the easy banter. Haruki was good company when he opened up a little. With that beard, you look like you could be in your late 30s, Haruki shot back. I'm your age. This time, there was real offense in Asuma's voice as he reached up to rub at his beard. It did not make him look old. Laughter rang out and all 3 adults turned to look at the genin on the ground. Ino bounded to her feet, having finished her lunch, and reached out to tug at Haruki's sleeve. Yeah, but Haruki-san doesn't have a beard, Asuma-sensei, Ino teased. And, she turned to glance pointedly between the 2 jounin. He's better looking. Asuma was somewhat surprised that Ino had said something so bold and guessed that they had gotten more comfortable in each other's company while he had been asleep. Ino may be outspoken and confident, but Asuma had come to realize that she only spoke about people so playfully when she was at ease in their presence. For his part, Haruki blinked down at the blonde, feeling rather thrown at the comment but chuckled good-naturedly after a moment. Exactly, Asuma. Even Ino-chan says so, and she's the only one here who's got an eye for that sort of thing, which means I'm right. Asuma scoffed, rolling his eyes as his female student beamed. He shot Inoichi a reproachful look when the man laughed and then turned a small scowl on the 2 boys still sitting on the ground. Both had amused grins on their faces as they finished up their lunches. From his spot a few steps away, Inoichi surveyed Team 10 and the red-haired jounin, and decided that accompanying the group today was one of the best decisions he had ever made. He eyed his daughter's hand tucked in a friendly manner in the crook of Haruki's arm as she continued to tease Asuma and debated the likelihood of the redhead shaking her off. Earlier, while Asuma had slept, Haruki had simply heaved a resigned sigh and left him to it. Instead, he had moved away to help his daughter and Chuji as they continued their attempts at chakra control. Chuji had steadily gotten better and better, inching his way up the tree as the minutes ticked by, but Ino had only managed to get about halfway and no further. 2 hours into the exercise and Inoichi had almost seen her frustration manifest a physical form when Chuji finally reached the top and flopped down on the ground for a breather. In this, he and his daughter were the same, at least when he had been her age. He had been every bit as impatient and easily frustrated as Ino was now, and that usually made itself known through an explosive temper. Inoichi had tensed when, after dozens of attempts and even more dents in the wood, his daughter had finally whirled on the sleeping figure of Shikamaru, mouth opening to vent her pent-up anger. He had often blown up at Shikaku and Chauza as well whenever he had failed at something multiple times, and he knew Ino was no different. But to his surprise, Haruki had cut in before Ino could say a word, and had asked the strangest thing. "Azalea, what does it mean?" Inoichi had had a hard time keeping the confusion off his face, and his daughter hadn't even bothered trying. "What?" she had snapped, her ire obvious in the tone of her voice, and Inoichi had inwardly winced at the rude attitude directed at Haruki. But the redhead hadn't even seemed to notice and merely cocked his head as he repeated his question. "What does an azalea mean? You work in a flower shop, you should know, right?" Ino had pushed away a few sweaty bangs before snapping irritably, "Temperance, or to take care of yourself for me. What does that have to do with anything?" Haruki had only shrugged and nodded at the tree. "One step. Go on." Ino's brow had furrowed even further but had obeyed after a moment of hesitation, taking a step onto the tree so that she was standing sideways at the very base of the tree trunk. She wobbled a little and her arms flailed, and Inoichi had been sure she would fall again, but Haruki had quickly continued with another question. "Bluebells. Meaning?" Ino had automatically answered, having been drilled on the many different types of flowers since she was a little girl by her mother, and she had steadied against the wood as her mind focused on something else. Humility and constancy. Haruki had nodded and motioned for her to take another step. Tiger lilies. Wealth and pride. Another step. Magnolias. Perseverance, dignity, and nobility. And another. Buttercups. Childishness or cheerfulness. And yet another. And so they went. Haruki would toss out the name of a flower and Ino would counter with its meaning, and Inoichi could only watch in amazement as the red-haired Jounin talked his daughter down from her rage and up the trunk of the tree. Her two teammates had sat up at this point, watching her progress with quiet astonishment. Finally, just before she had reached the top branch, Haruki had paused in his long list of flowers, head tilted back to maintain eye contact, and offered a small smile up at Ino. "One more then." "A solidago?" Ino had grinned, sweaty and smudged with dirt from all her failed attempts, but had crowed triumphantly, "Success," and had taken the final step, bringing her level to the highest branch of the tree. Haruki's face had relaxed into a wide grin, hands still stuffed into his coat pockets as he rocked back on his heels. "Well, look at that. It seems like you can do it after all." Inoichi had found himself smiling as well as his daughter's grin threatened to split her face. She had carefully made her way down the tree again, her steps much more sure and steady than before, and then she had bounced over to the redhead and thrown her arms around the Jounin in a grateful hug. Haruki had frozen, flinching minutely in surprise, and Inoichi had almost frowned when the redhead glanced over at him with something akin to uncertainty. He would have thought that Haruki had been worried about his reaction if it wasn't for the fact that his long years as an interrogator had helped him pick up the confusion and discomfort and distress in the man's stance, as well as the silent scream for help in his eyes. Inoichi had seen those emotions in some shinobi, not many, but enough to recognize it. He usually saw it in ninja that had been out on the field for too long and had forgotten what friendly human contact was like. Inoichi had seen it before, but only ever in the war veterans after the Third Shinobi War. He had straightened, mouth opening to tell his daughter to let go now because he had gone into the minds of some of those veterans and had seen a wrecked and ravaged world, desolate and dying, and if they weren't reintroduced to human contact in slow steps, it would cause a breakdown or worse. But Haruki had surprised him again when his body had forced itself to relax and an arm had circled around Ino's shoulders in an awkward hug, one hand patting her back before pulling away. "Thanks," Ino had exclaimed brightly, none the wiser as Haruki had smiled easily down at her, all the anxiety, fear, panic hidden safely away from prying eyes. "Don't think too hard," was all the redhead had told her. "You were just concentrating too much chakra before, and it was dragging you down." And then, 15 minutes later, Haruki had settled the 3 genin down with water and sandwiches and a soldier pill each. The redhead had made his way back to the tree he had originally been leaning against, and Inoichi had found an apology at the tip of his tongue. It hadn't been his fault, and it certainly hadn't been his daughter's fault, but the haunted, lost expression Haruki had directed at him had hit him hard, had brought him back to his days on the battlefield, and he had figured that someone should be sorry for putting that look on the Jounin's face, if only because Inoichi wasn't sure how to fix it. He barely knew anything about Kazuma Haruki. At least with the war veterans, he had been ordered by the Hokage to mend the shinobi's mental stability as best he could. Somehow, he doubted Haruki would want him poking around inside his head. But Haruki had only smiled at him, a little weary and a little grateful at the same time, as though Inoichi had already helped just by recognizing some of what the Jounin was going through. In the face of that smile, words had somehow seemed inadequate, and Inoichi had remained silent in the end. Blinking out of his thoughts, Inoichi studied the subtle tension currently lining Haruki's shoulders. Body language was something every interrogator had to know inside out, and he detected the way the redhead would stiffen ever so slightly when his daughter or her teammates crowded too close. Yet Haruki was still bantering effortlessly with Asuma, actions relaxed and easy to the untrained eye. Haruki was good, Inoichi approved. Even he probably wouldn't have noticed if not for Ino's hug earlier. But right now, to him, Haruki was clearly uncomfortable, and it was even clearer that he wouldn't say anything to push the genin away. Inoichi interrupted smoothly when the conversation paused for a second. "Did you take your soldier pill?" "Oh." Her hand slipped away from Haruki's arm, and Inoichi waited until he saw the redhead relax again before turning to watch his daughter gulp down the military ration. Her 2 teammates followed her example before turning back to Haruki. Haruki glanced at Inoichi out of the corner of his eye. The clan head wasn't even looking at him, but he knew the interrogator well enough that he was sure Inoichi had called his daughter's attention away from him on purpose. Still, the man wasn't showing any signs of it, so he put it to the back of his mind. "Now then," Haruki began once he had all 3 genin's attention again. "Your dear rank. Like Asuma said, you'll have to catch Tora for the daimyo's wife." Here, a smile bordering on sadistic curled his lips up as he handed out wireless radios for the genin. All 3 students eyed him warily as they accepted them. "But, instead of just running around anywhere you want, you'll be putting today's lesson to good use. Until this mission is completed, all 3 of you are only allowed to walk sideways or even upside down. Buildings, trees, whatever, just so long as you don't walk upright. Understand?" A horrified silence descended on the group. Asuma looked half amused, half appalled. "Are you trying to kill my students?" Haruki attempted a reassuring smile that, in Asuma's opinion, wasn't all that reassuring, especially with the evil glint in the redhead's eyes. "Of course not. It's good practice. I've seen genin do it before and they survived." Of course, they were his genin, and his students had been downright awesome in his opinion. Nevertheless, after the exercise Haruki had put them through, All three probably would have cursed him out if it hadn't been for the fact that they had been too tired to do so. Inoichi frowned, glancing sympathetically at his daughter. This would be tough, but if they succeeded, all three would never have to worry about chakra control again. Water walking would come that much easier as well. You heard him, he remained blank-faced when Ino shot him a betrayed look. Get moving. It's already past 1. At this rate, we'll still be here by dinner time. Shikamaru looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world, and the doomed expression on Chuji's face made it seem as if Haruki had sent them off to the gallows. Ino stayed silent for several seconds before throwing up her hands and marching forward, grabbing her two teammates by the arm and dragging them off to the nearest building. All right, let's do this. Come on Shikamaru, stop being so lazy. Chuji, cut the mournful look. The sooner we get this over with, the sooner we get to rest. Move it. Haruki chuckled and called out one last time, we'll meet up with you once you complete the mission. Shikamaru glanced back at him briefly, and Haruki hoped that at least the Nara had caught his hint. Akio had, and had prevented his two teammates from failing the mission in the end. Well, Haruki turned to the other two shinobi beside him and pulled out 3 more radios. Let's go see how they do. X. 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 It was a rare sight for the former head of interrogation, the son of the Sandame, and a rather unknown red-haired jounin to be seen squatting on a rooftop together and snacking on dango while listening in on the curses and yells and troublesomes of a bunch of genin, but Team 10 had been at it for 4 hours already and all 3 adults had gotten hungry. It wasn't so bad, Inoichi mused as he listened to his daughter shout at the Nara for the umpteenth time since their mission had started. At the very least, he hadn't been this entertained in a long time. Ah, they got stuck again, Asuma observed from beside him, lying on his stomach as curses rang over their wirelesses. Where the heck had his students picked up some of those swear words anyway? Haruki just sighed and checked the sky. His own genin team had completed this mission in just under 5 hours. At the rate Team 10 was going, they probably wouldn't beat the record. Because they could only walk on the side of buildings and telephone poles and upside down under alcoves, all 3 students had to keep doubling back whenever they found that they couldn't keep going on the route they had taken without jumping back to the ground or clambering up to the top of the roofs. Shikamaru had the least problem with this, only getting stumped twice, but he had been too lazy to even try to give his teammates better directions, and it wasn't until Ino had caught on to this fact and had started yelling at him over the wireless that the Nara had started giving them instructions. Now they had their work cut out for them trying to catch Tora. While Haruki's rule restricted them, nothing restricted the cat from moving however she wished. Don't you think this is a bit hard for them? Asuma winced when yowling was picked up on the radios, followed by more swearing when Tora inevitably escaped again. Judging by the rather stern frown on Inoichi's face, Ino was going to get an earful tonight. Haruki shrugged, sitting with his legs dangling over the side of the roof on Inoichi's other side. They can handle it. And once Shikamaru-kun gets his act together and stops sighing over everything, maybe they'll get somewhere. You think Shikamaru can come up with a plan? Inoichi asked, somewhat curious to see how Haruki thought this strange mission would pan out. Haoki hummed an affirmation. Chuji-kun's pretty good at sensing chakra signatures. He's the one who found Tora the last 5 times. Ino-chan's the fastest though, and she's already managed to get her hands on that cat 3 times. She just hasn't been able to hold on to her. If Shikamaru-kun can come up with a plan to utilize those 2 strengths, maybe we'll all be home in time for dinner. Inoichi nodded thoughtfully as Asuma dropped his head back down on his arms. This is going to take a while, he muttered gloomily as his stomach growled. Haruki rolled his eyes. Go get more food if you're hungry. Oh, here, he withdrew a few bills and thrust them at the jounin. Get me some gyoza while you're at it. Before Asuma could look more than a little indignant, Inoichi had also extended some money at him, nodding in agreement. Get me some yakisoba, Asuma. The chicken one. Thanks. Asuma spluttered out something that sounded a bit like lazy asses but heaved himself up anyway, taking the money before shining away. Inoichi and Haruki traded an amused look before settling into a companionable silence, listening to the latest generation of Inoshikajo stumble around the village. How did you know all those flowers? Inoichi spoke up suddenly after a few minutes. Some of the ones you threw out aren't all that well known. Haruki shrugged, his face carefully blank. I had a friend who knew her flowers. Her family owned a flower shop as well, she'd talk about them sometimes when I dropped by. Inoichi glanced sidelong at the redhead, and the interrogator part of him wanted to continue asking, but a bigger part of him wanted to leave it alone. It wasn't any of his business what the jounin chose to say and not say. They fell silent again, and this time, it was Haruki who broke it. May I ask a question about your former job? Inoichi stiffened but nodded after a contemplative moment. The jounin could ask, it didn't mean he would answer. If the Hokage asked, not ordered, asked you to take up your position in TNI again, would you? Inoichi arched an eyebrow. Most people would ask why I left in the first place. Haruki shrugged. He already knew why Inoichi had left. But he had always wanted to know if the feared interrogator would have refused to return if the Sandaime hadn't ordered him to. Well, I'm not most people. Inoichi fully agreed with that statement. He considered the question. It was a simple one, and it didn't require him to go into any details about his choice to retire. No, he voiced after a long moment. Probably not. If the Hokage doesn't order me to, it wouldn't be an emergency. Short of that, I won't ever return. Haruki nodded, quiet and unsurprised, and said no more. He knew Sarutobi would order Inoichi back before the Chuunin exams, but if the Yamanaka clan head didn't want to, then Haruki would put a stop to it. His times Inoichi had taught him a few interrogation techniques privy only to the Yamanaka clan just before he had infiltrated IWA. He could do it now instead if he had to, although he shuddered at the thought of having to tear through another person's mind. He didn't know how interrogators could stand it day after day. Your food. Asuma appeared beside them again, looking mildly grouchy as he passed out their meals. The jounin sensei had a dish of gyoza as well, though it was a larger portion than Haruki's. Haruki accepted his with a grin and Inoichi nodded his thanks. All three dug in and almost choked when Shikamaru's voice finally rose to something above his typical lazy drawl and overrode Ino's ranting and Chuji's complaints. All right, that's it. I can't stand this anymore. This is all so troublesome. Stop talking for a minute, woman, and listen to me. You're in charge of catching that stupid cat, but you'll come from the north. Chuji, find the damn thing but don't charge in. You pinpointed it? Good. Stay where you are until I get into position. We're going to catch it just as it's leaving the alleyway. Ino, wait just around the corner. Catch it when Chuji chases it out. I'll snag its shadow once you've got it. Ready? There was a slightly stilted silence over the wirelesses as all three adults paused and listened intently until they heard two confirmations. Finally, Haruki gulped down the rest of his gyoza before rising to his feet. Let's go watch. Inoichi quickly swallowed the last of his meal and tossed the plastic bowl away in a garbage can down below. Haruki swiftly did the same before they both turned to Asuma. The jounin blinked back at them, chewing slowly on a gyoza before shrugging as he swallowed. I like to actually taste what I eat. I'll take it with me. Where are we going? Haruki twitched a little before heaving a sigh and waving a hand. Follow me. We'll stay out of sight. X. 10 minutes later, they watched from a distance as Team 10 grappled with a wildly struggling cat. All three gathered together on the side of a building as Tora's caterwauling rang throughout the street. Great, Asuma looked relieved. They're done. Let's go cash this one in and go home. He made to jump down but Haruki's hand on his arm stalled him. Wait, Haruki murmured, blue gaze steady as he watched the three genin. They're not done. Asuma and Inoichi shared a frown but stayed still and watched, listening to Team 10's conversation over the wirelesses. Finally, Ino huffed, all but smothering the squirming cat inside Shuji's green jacket. We're done, right? Let's get down. My legs are killing me. Shuji nodded in agreement, face red from exertion as they both made to step down. Wait a second, Shikamaru's hand shot out to snag Shuji's shirt as he glanced up and down the street. What now? Ino snapped, frowning heavily as her feet slipped a little. Shikamaru stayed silent for a moment longer, looking hard in all directions before running a tired hand through his ponytail. I was afraid of this, he grumbled. Wasn't sure if this was what he meant, but it seems like it. What are you talking about, Shikamaru? Shuji took a steadying step up the side of the wall as he felt his bottom foot slide. Shikamaru exhaled gustily, irritation warring with exhaustion on his face. What was the last thing Haruki-san said to us? His two teammates frowned before Shuji spoke up. He said he'd meet up with us after we completed the mission. Yeah, Shikamaru nodded. So where is he? They both looked around. Ino scowled. You mean we're not finished? What else do we have to do? We caught the stupid cat? He said after we completed the mission, Shuji recalled, tugging at his scarf. And to complete a mission, don't we have to report back to the client or the Hokage? Ino looked gobsmacked while Shikamaru just tipped his head back as best he could while standing sideways. He had better chakra control than the other two, but even he was ready to just give up. Actually, he had been ready to give up 20 minutes into the mission, but Ino would have never shut up if he had. Exactly, Shikamaru poked at the bundle Ino was still holding. We need to get this thing to the Hokage Tower while walking sideways. God, we're going to be the laughing stock of Konoha by the end of the day. My old man is never going to let me live this down. This is so damn troublesome. For once, both his teammates looked like they fully agreed with him. Shikamaru's shoulders slumped even further. Can't we just give up? We could dash. No way. Ino barked out, elbowing him so hard he almost tumbled to the ground. We just spent the last 5 hours chasing this stupid thing. Here, she shook the cat almost violently, jacket and all. Shikamaru wondered if it would be considered a failed mission if they returned a dead cat to the daimyo's wife. Then he wondered why he even cared. If it was dead, then they would never have to do this troublesome mission again. One failed mission was worth that, wasn't it? I am not going to give up now. We are going to complete this mission even if I have to drag you both all the way to the Hokage Tower. Shikamaru's sweat dropped and shared a weary look with Shuji. His best friend shrugged, already resigned to their fate. They both knew better than to argue with their female teammate. All right then, Shuji tugged off his scarf completely, too hot to keep it on. Let's get going. X. You're a sadist, Asuma muttered, watching his team straggle towards the Hokage Tower. Those three are never going to forgive me for inviting you. Inoichi was torn between laughing and sighing. He settled for the latter and eyed the red-haired Jounin standing beside him. What would you have done if Shikamaru hadn't caught what you said? Haruki shrugged. They would have to do it all over again tomorrow. Inoichi shook his head as Asuma stared at him in uncomprehending disbelief. I am very glad you weren't my sensei. He spoke with feeling. I would have died. Haruki snorted. Oh, don't be so dramatic. Now go ahead to the Hokage Tower, will you? Tell all the shinobi on guard duty not to move, even if they're asked to. Asuma looked horrified. Those guards stand on either side of almost every doorway. Yup, Haruki almost chirped. Your students will just have to go over instead of jumping across. Asuma's shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine. I hope you realize that my students are going to hate me for the rest of eternity. He shined off, leaving a satisfied Haruki and an utterly bemused Inoichi. You push them pretty hard. The smile on Haruki's face slipped a little as he turned to give Inoichi a fleeting look. They're good. They've got a lot of potential. Asuma might enter them into the Chuunin exams. If he does, his eyes flashed back to the group of genin slowly making their way forward. They'll need as much training as they can get. Inoichi frowned. He was missing something here. Oh, he could see Team 10's potential as well. If they continued at this rate, he would approve of Asuma's decision to nominate them for the upcoming exams. But Haruki's words sounded almost like a warning. Come on, Haruki prompted, setting off after the genin. I want to see how they get through the Hokage Tower. Inoichi jumped after him, leaping to the next rooftop after the redhead. Haruki, he called out, eyes hard and voice completely serious for the first time since meeting the Jounin this morning. Haruki paused, coat flapping around him as a gust of wind rushed by. Ino's my precious little girl. I wouldn't want anything happening to her. That goes for her two teammates as well. The wind around them picked up for a moment and Inoichi knew it was reacting to Haruki when the redhead tipped his head over his shoulder to meet his gaze head on, and for once, that cerulean gaze was completely unveiled. And Inoichi read understanding there, and silent promises grimly made and fiercely kept, all tied together with the adamant steel of a man who knew what it was like to lose something irreplaceable and cherished, if only because he had already suffered through it once. Haruki inclined his head, eyes grave and meaningful. They will be safe. 4 simple words, spoken quietly and without theatrics, and Inoichi, who had always been taught to look further, dig deeper, never stop until he hit rock bottom, believed him instantly. And then Haruki blinked and the spell was broken, and the redhead moved away again, following Team 10. Without saying anything more, Inoichi followed, and wondered, for just a moment, why follow felt right. X. You were told not to move, weren't you? Shikamaru accused through gritted teeth. At this point, he really couldn't have cared less that he was on the verge of strangling the Chuunin on guard duty. The shinobi blinked blandly back at him. We cannot move, one said. It's our job to stand guard here. Swearing violently in his head, Shikamaru scooted around the guard, circling overhead to walk above the doorway. They had already passed several guards and Shikamaru had thought that maybe, if he asked nicely, then the guards would step aside so he could simply jump from one side of a doorway to the other. The width of the frame wasn't all that far and he would simply be able to move forward without taking detours. But the guards had refused to move, and Shikamaru swore that he would make Haruki pay for this torture in shogi, even if it took him a decade to thrash the man in a match. Behind him, Ino was cursing under her breath almost maniacally as Chuji trudged after them, each step coming down probably harder than necessary. Shikamaru. What are you doing? Shikamaru froze, heart dropping when his father's voice sounded from somewhere below him. Stiffly, he turned his head to stare at his dad, and caught sight of Chuji's father a step behind him, frowning in consternation. Shikaku looked completely bewildered as he stared back, a few files tucked loosely under one arm. Shikamaru felt for him, he was pretty damn bewildered himself. Why was he doing this again? He would have given up eons ago if Asuma had been the one to assign a mission like this to them. Granted, Asuma would never assign a mission like this, and even if he had, he wouldn't have cared much if Shikamaru did give up. But somehow, he thought maybe Haruki would be disappointed if he quit now. Later, he would have to think more on why he was actually bothered by that. Training, though dying is closer to the truth, he grounded out, before jabbing a finger over his shoulder. If you want to know more, ask our sadist of a sensei. He's probably having a good laugh right about now. What he said, Tou-chan, Shuji piped up from behind him. But we're almost done. Shikamaru grimaced visibly, eyeing the last flight of stairs that would lead up to the Hokage's office. If they walked on the ceiling and then went over the stairwell. "See you later, Tio-san," Shikamaru muttered distractedly as a route panned out before him. It would work. He was sure of it. And without further ado, he hurried on, his teammates trailing behind him with dragging feet. This was so troublesome. X. Our sons claim that they're dying. Would any of you happen to have some idea as to what's going on? Shikaku's dry tone came from behind them, and the three shinobi, crouched in the shadowed doorway of an empty meeting room as they watched the Genin's progress, turned to blink at the approaching Jounin commander and the Akimichi clan head beside him. Without hesitation, both Inoichi and Asuma pointed at Haruki. His idea. Haruki arched an eyebrow at the other two but turned a slightly strained smile in Shikaku's direction without calling them out. Their training. Their dear rank was to catch the daimyo's wife's cat, and now they're returning it to her. While walking sideways inside the Hokage tower. Shikaku pointed out. Haruki shrugged. They just learned the tree walking exercise today, so I told them that they could only walk sideways or upside down. He paused, and then added, by the way, your son should polish up his acting skills. He's not very good at pretending to have no chakra control. Shikaku shrugged, apparently not at all surprised that Haruki had caught on. He glanced at Chaoza instead and gestured, Haruki-san, this is Akimichi Chaoza, Shuji's dad. You remember him? Haruki nodded politely. Hello again, Chaoza-sama. Chaoza actually made a face. Chaoza is fine. No honorific please. It makes me feel older than I already am. Inoichi snickered and Shikaku's mouth twitched up. Haruki looked between them for a moment. Even in his own time, these three were always much more comfortable and relaxed in each other's company. Chaoza then, Haruki blinked when Inoichi cut in. Then me too. Inoichi is fine, the blonde glanced at Shikaku with a smirk. And Shikaku's just Shikaku. He already acts like a grouchy old man, there's no need to add any more years to him. Shikaku frowned at him before shrugging casually at Haruki. Shikaku's fine. Haruki nodded silently, glancing over at Asuma, who was looking somewhat amused. With an inward sigh, he turned back towards the group of genin. They're almost out of sight. I want to see them get past the Hokage store. Trading puzzled looks, the other shinobi trekked after the redhead as Team 10 disappeared to the top floor. X. Now what? Ino glared furiously at the two guards on either side of the Hokage's office door. If she hadn't been so angry and tired, she would have felt rather sorry that they both shrank back a little. Apparently, they saw her father's glare on her face. Shikamaru crouched on the wall, studying the doorway. On their way up, only the door at the entrance of the Hokage tower had given them any real trouble. But that door had been high enough that they could go above the guards' heads and cross the threshold sideways. The Hokage store, on the other hand, wasn't high enough for that. There was only about half a foot above the guards, and that wasn't enough room for Ino, much less Chuji. Which left the top. Which also meant, unfortunately, that they would have to enter the room by swinging down from a sideways position, standing upside down on the thin ledge that was the doorway, before yanking themselves back up to a sideways position again on the other side. This was beyond troublesome. All right, let's get this over with, Shikamaru sighed, straightening. I'll go first. Cautiously, he inched his way to the edge of the doorway, took a deep breath, planted a foot as close as he could to the underside of the door, and let gravity do the rest. Shikamaru could swear his heart stopped when he saw the floor rush up towards him, and he had to fight to not throw up his arms, concentrating on keeping his feet stuck to the top of the doorway instead. It didn't help that Ino had yelped Shikamaru. As soon as he had swung down. I'm fine. He snapped back, sharper than he had intended it. Grumbling wordlessly under his breath, he pulled himself up on the other side, gritting his teeth against the strain of his leg muscles. "Alright, next." Ino and Chuji looked at each other and it was Chuji who spoke up first. "I'll go first," he said firmly, clamping down on the embarrassed flush threatening to rise in his cheeks. "I'm heavier. If I lose my footing, I'll have both of you to catch me." Ino blinked, obviously surprised, but nodded in agreement. She shuffled as close to the door as she could, glaring nastily at the guard below her when he glanced up. Chuji gulped as he stared down at the floor. It seemed even farther than it had a moment ago. He took a deep breath, his grip on the scarf wrapped around his hand tightening. He had come this far. There were loads of times during the afternoon that he had wanted to just give up, but Shikamaru hadn't and Ino would have chewed his ear off, and he had figured he would eventually stumble and fall and that would be the end of this strange mission. But that eventually had never really come. He would stumble and slip but he had caught himself with his chakra every time in the end, and pushing himself a little more and a little more after that had ultimately brought him to the last obstacle of this mission. "Oi, Shuji, Kman," Shikamaru's voice sounded from the other side of the doorway. "If you slip, we'll catch you." A finger poked him in the shoulder and he blinked over at Ino. "You can do it, Shuji," Ino grinned at him, and Shuji thought back and honestly couldn't remember a time when Ino had encouraged him. He couldn't remember his female teammate ever looking so sweaty from training either and not seem to care about it. He took another deep breath and straightened. He had come this far, failing now would just be stupid. And Haruki had been the one who had assigned this mission. If the Jounin didn't think he could do it, he would have stopped him by now. He paused for a moment at that thought. Thinking back, he remembered that Haruki had never looked at him like he couldn't. And during the tree walking exercise, the Jounin had only smiled at him and nodded at his progress. Chuji had ended up reaching the top before Ino, who was usually better when they trained. Chuji straightened, frowning determinedly before sucking in a breath and letting himself fall. His eyes clenched shut instinctively even as he fought to keep chakra at his feet. He felt his left foot slip and panic immediately set in, his arms shooting out to grab at something. Two hands clasped his own, and above the roar of panic in his head, he heard his teammates' voices shouting at him. "Chuji, stop kicking. Calm down and concentrate. Damn it, Chuji. Foot. Your foot." His left foot slammed against a flat surface and he sent a surge of chakra down, or up, a part of his mind provided somewhat detachedly, and he was suddenly hanging upside down, as if he was back in the forest and sticking from a branch. Man, that was way too close. Chuji slowly opened his eyes, meeting Shikamaru's gaze above him. He stared back for a moment before a weak chuckle left his mouth. There really wasn't anything funny to laugh about, but the sound made Shikamaru grin and set Ino off as she laughed, a little amused at their situation but mostly relieved. "Come on, step up," Shikamaru ordered, extending a hand to pull him up. Chuji accepted it without hesitation and pulled himself over to the other side of the door. "My turn then," Ino called from the other side. Chuji blinked and then quickly spoke up, "Wait, Ino. Pass us the cat first." Shikamaru patted his shoulder. "Good thinking. If we lost the cat now, I think I'd go crazy." Muffled footsteps sounded before a bundle, which had long since stopped moving, and Chuji hoped rather half-heartedly that the cat was still alive. He didn't want it to die, of course, but he couldn't seem to muster up much sympathy for it right at the moment. Was passed over to them. Chuji tucked the cat under one arm before shuffling over to the other side of the door, his other hand free to catch Ino in case she slipped. "Ready?" Shikamaru sighed and leaned forward. "Ready. Go." Ino grimaced at the floor before gathering every last bit of courage she had. She had two teammates on the other side, ready to catch her if she fell, and as lazy and gluttonous as they could be, they had always listened to her. Perhaps it was time to listen to them, just a little. Ino? Come on. Don't worry. We'll catch you. Ino huffed. They didn't have to say it as if she was going to fall for sure. Come on, woman. Don't be troublesome. We're right here. She scowled. She was not troublesome, stupid Shikamaru. But, alright, I'm coming. She glared at the floor, daring gravity itself to pull her down, and then shut her eyes and dropped. For a fraction of a second during her free fall, Ino seriously considered chopping off her hair as soon as she got home. The extra weight did her no favors and only served to unbalance her as she swung down. Her arms jerked out, grasping at air as she fought against the downward pull and momentum. Hands suddenly clapped around her feet and she found herself hanging only by her ankles for a brief moment when her concentration faltered. And then sense rushed back into her mind and she circulated her chakra back down to her feet, not breathing until she found herself firmly stuck to the top of the doorway. Almost laughing as her heart pounded in her chest, Ino reached out a shaky hand that was immediately grabbed by Shikamaru and she was hauled up onto the other side, still slightly unsteady but slowly brightening as she realized they had done it. That was an impressive display of chakra control. The mild voice made all three of them freeze. They were in the Hokage's office. The Hokage's office. Which would actually mean that the Hokage would be in here. Their heads snapped around and they stared in growing dread at the Sandaime standing a few feet in front of them. Yes, they are amazing, aren't they? All three automatically looked down to meet a familiar blue gaze, a proud glint reflecting back at them. Haruki gestured at the floor. Come on down. You've done great. Shikamaru was the first to move, all but leaping away from the wall before sinking to the floor, sitting down with a thump. Apparently, he had chosen to ignore the Sandaime's presence for the moment. Chuji was next, jumping down and then staggering a bit but extending the cat in the general direction of the Hokage. The Sandaime chuckled and accepted the bundle, uncovering the jacket just enough so that one ear was revealed, twitching in irritation. Chuji sighed and dropped down beside Shikamaru, shoulders slumping with exhaustion. Ino leapt down almost right after, legs giving out as she plopped down beside Shikamaru. Mission accomplished. Now she just wanted to sleep until the cows came home. A hand on her shoulder made her stiffen and look around. She blinked in surprise as she caught sight of her father. How had she forgotten he was here? Oto-san. Shikamaru and Chuji looked around as well. Tio-yu-san. Tio-yu-chan. Shikaku and Chaozu stepped into the office, smiling at their respective sons. Asuma entered behind them, shaking his head in a mixture of pride and disbelief. That was some training, Shikaku remarked, crouching down beside Shikamaru. Chaozu nodded in agreement, placing an arm around Chuji's shoulders. Unbelievable. I can't believe you all got into the office. The Hokage chuckled and moved to place Tora into a small cage by his desk before returning with Chuji's jacket. I will have Tora delivered back to the daimyo's wife. And of course, this mission has been completed. I'll have your pay ready for you when you come in tomorrow morning. All three groaned simultaneously. They didn't even want to think about tomorrow. Foreign chuckles made them glance up as Haruki stepped in front of them, hands hidden in pockets again as he crouched down in front of them. Great job, he smiled softly at them and, despite their fatigue, they found themselves listening. That was awesome teamwork between you three. He paused before turning to Chuji first. Chuji-kun, good job at sensing Tora's chakra signature. Not many people your age can track chakra as well as you can, and you'll only get better as you practice more. Your chakra regulation is excellent. While you were chasing the cat, you were able to switch from one surface to the next with barely any pause. Just work on your stamina. The only reason you didn't make that swing just now was because you were tired. The switch with your right foot was flawless. Chuji flushed a little, straightening under the praise and nodded determinedly. Okay, Haruki-san. Thanks. Haruki nodded before shifting his attention onto Shikamaru. The Narair stared back grumpily and Haruki arched an eyebrow. Perhaps we'll leave that shogi game for another day, Shikamaru-kun. Shikamaru scowled. You knew we'd be dead on our feet. Or our butts. That's why you promised me. Haruki smiled easily at him. I did say anytime later. Don't worry, I'll play you whenever you want. I don't go back on my promises. Shikamaru just huffed and slumped back against his father's knee. So? What do I need to work on? Haruki tilted his head thoughtfully. Great stamina, especially for someone who would like nothing more than to laze around all day. Good strategic thinking, although you could have thought up a plan earlier. I know you could have, he gave the boy a pointed look before continuing. Your Kage Shibari no Jutsu could use some work. I'm no expert on your clan's techniques, but your target won't always stay in one spot for a long period of time. You need to up its speed. Your father can probably give you some tips. The redhead glanced briefly at Shikaku, who nodded. It was only at this point that Haruki realized that he had the entire room's attention. Clearing his throat uncomfortably, he tuned them out and turned back to Shikamaru. Other than that, there wasn't much else I saw today that you would need to pay special attention to. I'd suggest eating more though. He reached out to gently circle one of Shikamaru's wrists with forefinger and thumb. You're a bit skinny and I bet you're exhausted right now. Good stamina doesn't necessarily mean you'll still have energy after you slow down. Shikamaru blinked at his own wrist before nodding. He supposed eating more would probably be a good idea. And he knew his shadow technique was slow. Maybe he could practice catching leaves first. Lighter objects would be easier to work on. He didn't notice the veiled astonishment on his father's face as he accepted the redhead's advice. Thanks, Haruki-san. Haruki smiled again before turning to Ino. Well, your chakra controls improved quite a bit from this morning. Ino grinned tiredly. My legs are dead. Haruki chuckled. Ma, your stamina needs some work as well. But you've got excellent speed. When you ran across flat surfaces without having to turn a corner, even if you were just leaping from building to building, you didn't have to slow down at all. Unlike Shoji-kun though, you do need to work on your chakra regulation. I think that's the biggest problem you'll have with chakra control. Water walking will be a bit of a challenge. Ino pouted before brightening hopefully. Will you come back to train us for that? Chuji straightened as well and even Shikamaru glanced up attentively. Haruki arched an eyebrow. You want me to come back? Asuma's been convinced all afternoon that you'll be cursing me out by the end of the day. Asuma smothered a laugh with a cough, moving forward to stand beside Haruki. Chuji looked up at Asuma with a small frown. I don't mind if Haruki-san comes back. Asuma scratched his head. Really? From all the swearing I heard today, I thought you'd be boycotting training sessions from now on. Chuji looked a little flustered but shook his head anyway. It was hard, really hard, but... He glanced at Shikamaru and Ino who both had matching smiles on their faces, exultant and proud. We did it? I mean, how many other genin teams can say they learned chakra control and got through Haruki-san's mission all in one day? Asuma did laugh at that. I don't think anyone's gone through Haruki's mission before. Haruki shrugged in response as he rose to his full height again. Just doing the D-rank mission is boring. For you, Shikamaru griped. At least it's less troublesome for us. But it helped, yeah. Shikamaru blinked and then heaved a resigned sigh. Yeah, but it was still troublesome. Troublesome, but worth it in the long run. A lot of things in life are like that, Shikamaru-kun. Haruki stepped back glancing absently at the window. His times Shikaku had said that to him once, and he had never forgotten it. Checking the sun's position in the sky, he missed the startled look from Shikaku. But you will train with us again, right? Ino persisted. And next time, you can come earlier so I can show you around my family's flower shop. A bright grin, childish and innocent, and one that Haruki hadn't seen on Ino's face in a long time. We even have solidagos, though most people don't want them. Haruki smiled and looked over at Asuma. Well, if Asuma doesn't mind, I'll come back next week. Asuma nodded readily. If you can spare a few hours, come back anytime. He grinned. I had fun today. 3 glares were immediately shot at him. You didn't do anything. Ino protested. Asuma drew himself up in mocking indignity as he waved a hand at Haruki and Inoichi. That's not true. Those two made me their food runner today. The 2 aforementioned shinobi shared an amused look. He was a good food runner, Haruki commented. I agree, Inoichi nodded somberly. He was very quick about it. Asuma frowned at both of them while his students grinned. It was fun watching their sensei get picked on. A quiet clearing of someone's throat made all of them look around. They all straightened, or scrambled to their feet in the genin's case, when their attention fell on the sandame. Sorry, old man, Haruki apologized sheepishly, not seeing the startled looks behind him. I made all this part of their training. I gathered that. Sarutobi watched them with an amused air about him. It was rare for the senior Inoshikajo generation to be so relaxed in the company of others nowadays, even when together. But I do have paperwork to complete, so, if you're done here, he glanced meaningfully at the door. All the adults sketched hasty bows or nods before ushering the genin towards the door. Sarutobi met Haruki's eyes briefly and nodded when Haruki glanced at his private office. With a nod in return, Haruki turned and left as well, closing the door behind him. X. And I don't care how tired you are, eat a full dinner before you go to bed. Understand? Much to the amusement of their fathers, all 3 students nodded obediently as Haruki lectured them. His eyes seemed to focus on Shikamaru as he finished, and the Nara rolled his eyes but nodded once more to show his agreement. Okay then, I guess that's it for today. Unless Asuma has something to add? Haruki glanced over at Team 10's actual sensei but Asuma only shrugged good-naturedly. Nothing to add, the Jounin said with a wry smile. Haruki covered everything. We'll meet for training tomorrow at 10 as usual. Groans immediately filled the air. But sensei. Ino protested. We're exhausted. I have never worked so hard in my entire life, Shikamaru complained. Give us a break, Asuma sensei. We're dying, Shuji announced, rubbing at a thigh. Give us an extra hour at least. Asuma crossed his arms. No way. 10's late enough. Ino huffed. I have to get up early to help my mom set up shop. 10's not late. Asuma didn't even blink. Haruki shook his head and crouched down to whisper something in the blonde's ear. Ino's eyes widened and a gleeful light appeared in her eyes. Asuma watched her warily. Got it? Ino sang out before looking up at Asuma. Asuma-sensei, please give us an extra hour to sleep in tomorrow. Asuma shook his head. I already said N. He trailed off when he caught sight of the big baby blue eyes staring teary-eyed up at him. Oh crap. Ino. He warned. The puppy dog eyes intensified. Asuma stared for a moment longer and then folded like wet paper. Fine. We'll meet at 11. Ino cheered while Chuji and Shikamaru scoffed but didn't complain. Cool, that works. Ino beamed at the red-haired Jounin. Thanks, Haruki-san. Haruki chuckled, ignoring the dirty look Asuma tossed his way. Ma, just don't use it too often or it might lose its effect. Ino nodded enthusiastically while Inoichi sighed behind her. He had a feeling that look would be turned on him sooner or later. He shot a glare at Shikaku when the man elbowed him with a smirk. See you later then, Haruki nodded at the 6 in general. He and Asuma were going the same way. Several good nights later and the two jounin were heading down a street away from the Hokage Tower, the setting sun casting an orange-red glow over everything. Asuma had quickly lit a cigarette as soon as the two groups went their own way. He hadn't smoked all day and it had been chafing on his nerves. Haruki didn't seem to mind and they walked in a companionable silence as they headed back to their respective homes. "There was actually another reason I invited you today," Asuma admitted out of the blue. He wasn't sure how to post his question, so he figured he might as well start with a confession. Beating around the bush never did any good. Haruki only turned a mildly curious look on him. He had pulled out the hair tie holding back his hair and the crimson locks now hung around his shoulders again. "The Sandaime is my father," Asuma started, but forged on when he didn't detect any surprise. "We had dinner a while back. We don't usually, we're not on the best of terms at the moment." Again, he paused, waiting for the shocked exclamation that usually followed this revelation. After all, who wouldn't want a good relationship with the Hokage? But he wasn't all that surprised either when he didn't receive it. "He invited me for dinner though, and it was actually all right." He turned to study the redhead. "He said he kept your advice in mind. What did you say to him?" Haruki was silent for a while, gaze flickering from house to tree to shop. "Ma, it wasn't anything special," he finally said. "I just told him that, while he can have his own opinion on something, he should also try to understand the same issue from someone else's point of view." He paused for a heartbeat before a small smile tilted his lips up. "Hearing someone is easy, understanding them is much harder. The trick is to find the key. Some people use words and that works, while others trade blows." His smile grew a little wider. "And that works too. But either way, you still have to really look and really listen to understand." Asuma frowned a little. He wasn't sure he completely grasped what Haruki meant, but he thought he might with some time. His father had prompted him to talk about some aspects of his life and the man had listened attentively the entire time, hung on to every one of his words as if they were important. "But why?" he finally asked. This had been bothering him the most. It didn't really surprise him that Haruki had already known about his familial connection to the Sandaime. The redhead always seemed to know more than he let on. But he didn't get why the other jounin would go out of his way to prod his stubborn father into action over something that really didn't impact Haruki in the slightest. "Why did you tell my father all that?" Again, Haruki was silent for a long while, and Asuma was starting to think that the jounin wouldn't answer as they reached the end of the street. And then Haruki smiled, sad and wistful and tired all at once. "My parents died when I was a baby." Haruki didn't look at him, simply staring ahead with the glow of the sunset in his eyes, turning them to an almost purple. "And I never had the opportunity to say goodbye to either of my godparents before they died too." The cerulean turned amethyst gaze finally met his own head on. "I guess I told him because I think family is important. I think that if I ever had any family, even if I got into the mother of all arguments with them, I'd still want to do everything I could to make up with them." Asuma couldn't even blink if he wanted to as Haruki's gaze seemed to deepen for a second. "Because you never know when that chance will be taken away. Then you'll be left with nothing but regrets, and I think that's the saddest thing of all, to know what you could have had and know what you should have done, but not have any way to fix it." Asuma stayed still and silent, not sure what to say as that mesmerizing gaze finally pulled away and the redhead seemed to burrow deeper into his coat as a gust of wind rippled by. "Well," Haruki continued in a much lighter tone. "I turn off here. I'll see you around, Asuma. Good night." "Night," Asuma echoed, cigarette dangling absently from his right hand as he watched Haruki disappear down the street, crimson hair like a beacon of fire. He didn't move until Haruki was completely out of sight, the other jounin's words still ringing in his head. And then he turned and started making his way back to the Hokage Tower. He wondered how his father felt about Korean. He had heard that Yakiniku-Q had a discount tonight.